What does it look like when a civilization loses its memory? Not a person forgetting where they put their keys, but an entire culture, its poetry, its mathematics, its star charts, its medical notes, just slipping away into silence. Close your eyes for a second and picture it. Shelves and shelves of scrolls, hundreds of thousands of them, some say closer to 500,000, all sitting in one city on the coast of Egypt. And then picture those shelves slowly over centuries going quiet. That's the question we're going to sit with tonight. Not with panic, not with drama, just with curiosity. The kind of curiosity that lets your mind wander and your body settle into the sheets. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, you're exactly who I make these for. So, before we drift into ancient Alexandria, do me a favour. Drop a comment and tell me where you are right now and what time it is there. I read these. It's wild to picture it. Someone in Manila already asleep, someone in Lisbon just closing their laptop, someone in Denver still finishing dinner, all listening to the same story about a library that vanished nearly 2,000 years ago. There's something comforting about that, isn't there? All of us, scattered across time zones, thinking about the same lost scrolls at the same moment. Now, here's the thing about the Library of Alexandria. Almost everyone has heard of it. Almost everyone has heard some version of the story. Caesar burned it, or maybe it was religious riots, or maybe it was Arab conquerors centuries later, supposedly ordering the scrolls burned because, as the story goes, if they agreed with the Quran they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed they were dangerous. It's a great story, dramatic, simple, satisfying. It's also, as we'll see, almost certainly more complicated than that. And that complication is where the real story lives. Because here's what we're actually going to investigate tonight, slowly, carefully, without rushing to easy answers. What was truly lost when Alexandria's great collection faded? What likely survived, hidden in translations in monastery basements, in the margins of other books? And how, centuries later, historians and papyrologists try to tell the difference between a fact, an inference, and a legend that got repeated so many times it started to feel like history. Because the library wasn't really one single building you could burn down in an afternoon. It was closer to an institution, a sprawling ecosystem of scholars, copyists, translators, argument, and ink. Scrolls came in through trade ships and left through scribes, recopying them by candlelight. Knowledge moved through that place like blood through a body, constantly circulating, constantly being renewed, which means its disappearance wasn't necessarily one single catastrophe. It may have been something slower, something more like erosion, or maybe in some strange way, something more like diffusion. We're going to move gently through the evidence tonight, through the uncertainties historians actually admit to, and through some genuinely surprising survivals you probably haven't heard about. If stories like this help you drift off, the kindest way to support the show is to follow it on Spotify and leave a 5-star review. There's a link in the description, and it genuinely helps more people find these late-night histories. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Before there was a library, there was just an idea and a young king who wanted to build something the world had never seen. Let's go back to 331 BCE, more than a decade before anyone had thought about collecting scrolls. Alexander the Great is moving through Egypt, not really as a conqueror in the violent sense, at least not there. The Egyptians had been under Persian rule and many of them seemed to have welcomed him as a liberator, or at least as the lesser evil. And somewhere along a strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and a shallow lake called Mareotis, Alexander apparently stopped, looked at the landscape and decided this was the spot. Not Memphis, the old capital, not any of the existing Egyptian cities with their centuries of temples and tradition already built into the ground. A patch of coastline, mostly fishing villages before this, with a small settlement called Rakotis nearby. Why there? Well, this is where the story gets interesting, because Alexander wasn't just picking a pretty view. He was looking at geography the way a chess player looks at a board. This spot sat exactly where the Mediterranean world could connect to Egypt's interior, and through the Nile to the Red Sea, and through the Red Sea to the trade routes running toward Arabia and eventually India. Picture the map for a second. Ships coming from Greece, from Italy, from the Levant, all funneling naturally toward this one stretch of coast, because it had something almost nowhere else nearby had, a natural harbour sheltered by an island called Pharos, plus freshwater access from the Nile close enough to matter. Alexander apparently sketched out the city's basic layout himself, according to the ancient sources, though how much of that is embellishment added later is honestly hard to say. Ancient biographers loved giving their heroes moments of visionary genius, and Alexander walking along a beach personally designing a metropolis is exactly the kind of scene that gets exaggerated with retelling. What we can say with more confidence is that he assigned the actual work to an architect, a man named Dinocrates, and then Alexander left. He never saw the city that would carry his name. He went off to conquer the rest of the known world and died in Babylon 8 years later, before Alexandria had grown into anything more than a construction site with big ambitions. So the city was, in a strange way, orphaned before it was even finished. Alexander's empire fractured after his death, divided up among his generals in a chaotic scramble historians call the Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors. And one of those generals, a man named Ptolemy, ended up with Egypt. Now here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Ptolemy wasn't Egyptian. He was Macedonian, one of Alexander's childhood friends and most trusted commanders. He had no natural claim to rule the Nile Valley, no bloodline connecting him to pharaohs, no religious legitimacy in the eyes of the Egyptian priesthood, who had, for thousands of years, decided who counted as a proper ruler. This was a problem, a serious one, because ruling Egypt without some kind of legitimacy meant ruling through pure force, and pure force is exhausting, expensive, and eventually it fails. So Ptolemy, and later his son Ptolemy II, made a calculated decision. If you can't inherit legitimacy, you build it. And one of the most effective ways to build legitimacy in the ancient world, it turns out, was through culture. Through spectacle, through positioning yourself as a patron of knowledge so overwhelming, so impressive, that people simply couldn't imagine you as an illegitimate foreign upstart. You'd be something more, a civilizer, a new kind of pharaoh, one who ruled not just through armies but through ideas. This is really the seed of everything we're going to talk about tonight. The library wasn't born out of pure intellectual curiosity, though that mattered too. It was born out of political necessity, dressed up in the language of scholarship. Knowledge in Ptolemaic Alexandria was never just knowledge for its own sake. It was a tool for legitimacy, a tool for prestige, a tool for diplomacy, because visiting dignitaries from Rome, from Syria, from Macedonia, from anywhere in the Mediterranean world could be brought to Alexandria and shown something no other city on earth could match. And a tool, quietly, for administration too, because governing a place as complex as Egypt, with its ancient bureaucratic traditions already thousands of years old before the Ptolemies arrived, required record-keeping, translation, calculation, all the unglamorous machinery of actually running a kingdom. Meanwhile, the city itself was growing into something the ancient world had never quite seen before. Alexandria wasn't built slowly over centuries like most great cities, layered up organically from village to town to metropolis. It was planned, laid out on a grid with wide, straight avenues, something Greek city planning had been experimenting with elsewhere, but rarely at this scale. 2 enormous harbours, one facing the Mediterranean for international trade, one facing Lake Mareotis for river traffic coming down from the Nile Valley, and rising above the eastern harbour eventually, a lighthouse so tall and so famous that its name, Pharos, became the root word for lighthouse in multiple languages that still exist today. French, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, they all carry a little piece of that ancient tower in their vocabulary even now. The population that filled this city was, by ancient standards, remarkably mixed. You had Greeks, of course, arriving as soldiers, administrators, merchants, settlers looking for opportunity in a freshly built city with room to make a name for yourself. You had native Egyptians, who made up probably the largest single group, working the land nearby, filling the markets, maintaining religious traditions that stretched back further than anyone could really calculate. You had a substantial Jewish community, one of the largest outside of Judea itself, so large and so established that eventually the Hebrew scriptures would be translated into Greek, right there in Alexandria, a project later called the Septuagint. You had Phoenicians, Syrians, Persians, Nubians moving up from the south, merchants from as far as India occasionally passing through on trade routes that connected the Red Sea to markets thousands of miles away. This mattered enormously, this mixing, because ideas, it turns out, don't spread very well in isolated, homogeneous populations. They spread when different traditions bump into each other, when a Babylonian astronomer's methods for tracking planetary movement end up in conversation with a Greek geometer's approach to proving things through logical deduction, when Egyptian medical papyri, some already over 1,000 years old by this point, get examined alongside Greek theories about the body. Alexandria became, almost by accident of its cosmopolitan population, a place where knowledge from wildly different traditions could collide, compare notes and occasionally merge into something new. The infrastructure of the city reflected these ambitions too, even before a formal library existed. There were temples, of course, including eventually a massive one dedicated to a new hybrid god called Serapis, deliberately designed to appeal to both Greek and Egyptian religious sensibilities at once, another calculated move toward legitimacy. There was a royal palace complex along the harbour, sprawling and secure, where the Ptolemaic dynasty could conduct the actual business of governing, while also, crucially, hosting scholars, philosophers and specialists under royal patronage. And there was already, by necessity, a growing bureaucracy, scribes and administrators managing tax records, grain shipments, legal disputes, all the paperwork required to keep a kingdom of several million people functioning. Egypt under the Ptolemies remained, in many ways, one of the most administratively sophisticated states in the ancient Mediterranean world, precisely because the underlying Egyptian systems of record-keeping were already ancient and effective long before the Greeks arrived. So, when we talk about the Library of Alexandria being founded, probably sometime in the early 3rd century BCE under Ptolemy I, or possibly completed under his son Ptolemy II, we shouldn't picture it as some isolated, spontaneous act of intellectual generosity. It emerged from a city that had already been engineered, quite deliberately, to be a centre of gravity for trade, for administration, and for cultural prestige. The library wasn't an accident that happened to occur in Alexandria. Alexandria was practically designed to eventually produce something like a library, a new dynasty needing legitimacy, a cosmopolitan population capable of generating and exchanging ideas across cultural lines, a geographic position perfectly suited to pulling in texts, travellers and traders from every direction, and a bureaucratic tradition inherited from thousands of years of Egyptian statecraft that understood knowledge itself could be organised, catalogued and put to use. All the pieces were already in place. All that was missing now was the institution itself and the man who would help give it its shape. Which brings us to a strange and sprawling place called the Mouseion, and the surprisingly blurry question of what the Library of Alexandria actually was. The name gives us our first clue, Mouseion. Not library, not archive, but the place of the muses. In Greek imagination, The Muses were the goddesses of the arts and sciences, the sources of inspiration for poets, historians, mathematicians, musicians. So when the Ptolemies created a Mouseion in Alexandria, they weren't just building a warehouse for books. They were trying to build a living machine for producing knowledge. Ancient descriptions, though sparse, sketch an institution that sounds more like a research university than a modern public library. The Mouseion seems to have been part of the royal palace complex, protected and fed by the king's wealth. Scholars attached to it received stipends, free meals, perhaps even tax exemptions. They lived and worked together, sometimes for decades in a kind of scholarly cloister. Imagine the rhythm of life there, not as a scene of hushed aisles and silent reading, but of constant low murmur, shared dining rooms where philosophers argued over grammar and cosmology between mouthfuls of bread, walkways shaded from the Alexandrian sun where mathematicians sketched diagrams in sand, then erased them with a heel to make room for the next idea. Regular lectures, recitations, discussions, all under the protective umbrella of royal patronage. In that sense, the Mouseion was the beating heart. The library, the famous Library of Alexandria, was its circulatory system. When ancient writers talk about the library, they're not just talking about shelves lined with papyrus. They're talking about an integrated operation, a collection of texts, yes, but also a catalogue to make sense of them, and a copying and editing apparatus to maintain and expand them. We tend to picture a static hoard, scrolls sitting quietly, waiting to be read. What existed in Alexandria was closer to a workshop. Scrolls arrived from ships, from diplomatic gifts, from purchases, and probably from less voluntary methods too, which we'll talk about later. But they didn't simply get dumped onto shelves. They were cleaned up, copied when necessary, compared against other versions if they existed. Titles and authors were assigned or guessed at. Texts were slotted into a mental map of knowledge. Poetry here, medical treatises there, histories in another place, philosophical works scaffolded by commentaries. This is where the librarians come in, and in Alexandria librarian meant something more like chief research director than person who checks your books out. The most famous of these, men like Xenodotus, Callimachus, and later Aristarchus, were not just caretakers. They were active scholars. One might spend years comparing different copies of Homer, marking doubtful lines, proposing which passages were later interpolations, devising signs in the margins to guide future readers. Another might compile lists of authors by city of origin, or by genre, or by first line of a work. They wrote commentaries, produced critical editions, taught students who would themselves go on to teach elsewhere in the Mediterranean. So when we talk about the Library of Alexandria, we're talking about this whole ecosystem, the Mouseion as a residential community of scholars with salaries and dining halls and lecture spaces, the library as the massive, constantly tended body of texts that fed their work, and the staff, librarians, scribes, assistants, who turned chaotic piles of papyrus into something that could actually be navigated. There's another assumption it's helpful to loosen before falling asleep with a single gigantic building in your mind. The idea that the library was one place, one hall, one iconic structure that either stood or fell all at once. Our sources don't really support that picture. We do hear about a primary collection attached to the Mouseion, almost certainly within or right next to the royal quarter. Later, we start hearing about a second major repository of books associated with the Temple of Serapis, the Serapeum, in another part of the city. Ancient authors sometimes call this a daughter library, suggesting a branch, an overflow, or perhaps a more public-facing collection. Did the Mouseions scholars walk down broad streets to consult duplicates at the Serapeum? Did the Serapeum gather its own specialized collection over time, influenced by but not identical to the royal holdings, The evidence is thin, and historians disagree on the details, but it's very likely that by the Roman period there were multiple significant concentrations of books in Alexandria, not a single monolithic vault of knowledge. This matters when we consider what it meant to call the library universal. Ancient writers loved grand claims, and the Ptolemies encouraged them. The dream, as it's often reported, was to collect all the books in the world. It sounds impossibly arrogant until you remember what the world looked like to a Hellenistic monarch. For a Ptolemaic king and his court, universal meant the universe of texts that mattered to them. Greek literature in all its forms, plus key works from older, prestigious cultures that could be translated into Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, maybe some Persian, maybe Hebrew. It did not mean they had every poem sung in a village in India, or every technical manuscript in a workshop on the far edge of Central Asia. Even within the Mediterranean, a universal library was as much an aspiration as a reality. Ships were missed, regions were inaccessible or politically hostile, texts decayed before they could be copied. What made the Alexandrian project radical wasn't that they actually had everything, but that they tried to imagine everything as a possible collection, something that could, in theory, be gathered, classified, and brought under royal control. And finally, the way we know about all of this shapes the myths that grew up later. Our information about the Mouseion and the library comes in fragments, scattered over centuries, a passing remark in Strabo, a hostile jab in a Roman satire, a reverent mention in a late antique author trying to remember a lost golden age of learning. By the time medieval and early modern writers rediscovered these scattered notes, Alexandria had already fallen on hard times more than once. It became easy, almost irresistible, to compress all the complexities into a single image. One library, one blaze, one night when all the knowledge of antiquity supposedly went up in flames. But the reality, as far as we can reconstruct it, is murkier and more interesting. A royal research community with salaries and shared meals. A dynamic library that was catalogue as much as collection, workshop as much as storeroom. Multiple sites distributed over a changing city. An ambition to be universal that was always straining against physical limits. And a long, uneven history that can't be reduced to a single disaster. In the next part of our story, we'll look more closely at how this system actually acquired its texts, how scrolls moved from distant corners of the Mediterranean into the hands of Alexandrian scribes, and what that tells us about the economics, the ethics, and the quiet violence of book collecting in the ancient world. If you think of the library as a living creature, then acquisition was its appetite. And like any royal appetite in the Hellenistic world, it wasn't just a matter of taste. It was policy. The Ptolemies did not sit back and hope books would drift to them like flotsam. They pushed, they bought, they commissioned, they used diplomacy. When an embassy arrived from another kingdom, they weren't just greeted with banquets and processions. At some point in the quieter rooms of the palace, an official would ask a different set of questions. What books do your scholars use? Who keeps your temple records? Are there copies of your law codes, your histories, your sacred texts that might be shared? Sometimes this sharing meant formal exchanges. We hear, for example, of the Athenians lending official copies of tragic plays to the Ptolemies for the purpose of making transcripts. The story, preserved in later sources, claims that the Alexandrians paid a huge deposit, promised to return the originals, and then decided they preferred the real thing. They kept the Athenian state copies in Alexandria, sent back fresh but technically inferior copies, and forfeited the money without a second thought. Whether every detail of that anecdote is true or not, it captures something essential about the royal mindset. A good copy of an important text was worth more than gold. And the best copy of all was the one that claimed to be closest to an original. Outside the realm of polite diplomacy, acquisition became more aggressive. Ancient writers, especially those hostile to Ptolemaic pretensions, loved to repeat stories about Alexandrian officials searching incoming ships. The tale goes like this. Every vessel that docked in Alexandria was inspected. If any scrolls were found, personal libraries, merchants' manuals, a poet's prized manuscript, they were taken to the library. Skilled scribes made copies. The originals were shelved in the royal collection. The owners received the copies back, sometimes with a label indicating they were from the ships. Is this literally, systematically true? It's hard to say. The practice in its most extreme form may be exaggerated, a kind of literary caricature that casts the Ptolemies as book pirates. But it's entirely plausible that something like it happened at least some of the time. The port was the kingdom's throat. The palace controlled the throat. If the royal ideology said all books should be here, then searching cargoes for valuable texts would have felt less like theft and more like due diligence on behalf of civilization. Behind these dramatic stories, the everyday machinery of acquisition was quieter and slower. For every famous seizure of a ship's scrolls, there were probably dozens of routine transactions. A merchant from Rhodes arrives, knowing the librarians will pay well for a clean copy of an astronomical treatise. A scholar in Asia Minor hears that Alexandria is offering stipends to anyone who can bring obscure genealogies or local histories. A priest from an Egyptian temple complex negotiates controlled access to ancient ritual texts in exchange for Ptolemaic favour. However they arrived, scrolls entering the library passed into the hands of people whose job was not simply to stack them, but to remake them. A papyrus roll was fragile, imperfect, and often messy. Margins were cramped or uneven, corrections dotted the lines, names of authors were missing or contradictory. The Alexandrian solution was the scribal workshop. Here, under the direction of scholars and senior librarians, teams of scribes copied manuscripts line by line. It was painstaking work. A long historical scroll might take days of concentrated effort, an epic poem, weeks. Mistakes were inevitable, a duplicated line here, a skipped phrase there, a misread word that subtly changed a meaning. Senior scholars reviewed these copies, marking corrections, comparing them against other exemplars if they existed, and sometimes making choices about which version to treat as authoritative. All of this depended on a resource that Egypt had in abundance, papyrus. Along the Nile, reeds were harvested, their pith sliced into thin strips, soaked, pressed in perpendicular layers, and dried into sheets. These sheets were then joined into rolls, often several meters long, on which texts were written in narrow columns. Compared to writing on clay or carving on stone, papyrus was light, portable, relatively cheap to produce. This gave Egypt, and Alexandria in particular, a structural advantage in the book trade. A kingdom sitting in the middle of the Nile papyrus industry could feed a vast scribal apparatus in a way other cities could not easily match. But papyrus was also vulnerable. Humidity, insects, careless handling, and time all conspired against it. In the dry sands of the Egyptian countryside, papyrus could survive for centuries or even millennia buried in rubbish heaps. In a crowded coastal city like Alexandria, the conditions were less forgiving. A single copy, if it was not recopied, was always on its way to becoming dust. That's one reason a good copy had such value. Not just any transcription, but one that had been checked, corrected, and anchored to a scholarly tradition. Imagine multiple versions of a poem circulating around the Mediterranean, each with local additions, missing lines, or altered endings. When such a poem reached Alexandria, it entered a kind of textual courtroom. Librarians would gather competing copies, weigh their readings, decide which lines looked like later intrusions and which seemed more consistent with an author's style. They marked their judgments with small symbols in the margins or in separate commentaries. Over time, the Alexandrian edition of a work became a reference point. Other cities might request copies from Alexandria, trusting that what they received had passed through expert hands. That authority amplified Alexandria's influence, but it also came with a quiet cost. Because when a powerful centre decides which version of a text is best, other versions begin to look dispensable. A local variant of a tragedy in Syracuse, a slightly different philosophical dialogue in a small school in Asia Minor, if they diverged too far from the Alexandrian standard, they might be dismissed as corrupt or secondary. Fewer people would bother to copy them. Over centuries, those branches of the tradition could simply vanish. Acquisition strategies, then, didn't just fill Alexandrian shelves. They reshaped the entire ecology of texts around the Mediterranean. By pulling books toward a single royal centre, by privileging certain copies as good and letting others quietly fall away, the Ptolemies and their librarians helped decide not only what would be preserved there, but what could even survive anywhere else. Later, when fires, wars, and neglect gnawed at Alexandria's collections, those earlier choices mattered. Works that had been centralized, standardized, and nowhere else robustly preserved were more fragile than anyone at the time could have realized. Others, which had never quite been captured or normalized, lingered on in provincial libraries and schools, in private collections beyond the king's reach. To understand what the Library of Alexandria truly lost, and what managed to slip past its gravitational pull, we have to turn to the people who tried to make order out of its flood of scrolls, the cataloguers. And one man in particular, Callimachus, who looked at this ocean of papyrus and decided that if the library was going to be universal, it needed a map. Callimachus was one of those people who looks at chaos and immediately starts sorting it into piles. He arrived in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, probably from the Greek city of Cyrene in North Africa. He was a poet by training, sharp-tongued, famously opinionated, the kind of person who could write a biting epigram about an enemy and then go back to correcting a verb form in Hesiod. At some point, whether as a full librarian or a senior scholar attached to the library, he was given a problem that no one had faced at this scale before. Too many books. In the early days, the collection might have been small enough that senior scholars simply knew where things were. The medical scrolls are over there, Homer is along that wall, the local Egyptian chronicles are in the back. But acquisitions kept coming. Royal initiatives, ship seizures, diplomatic exchanges, private donations, commissioned copies, shelves multiplied, rooms filled. A single work might exist in multiple versions, from different cities, with slightly different titles. At some point, human memory and casual familiarity stopped being enough. A scholar walking into the stacks could no longer just ask the nearest scribe, "Where's that treatise on comets?" and expect an answer. The library was undergoing the same transition that later universities, monasteries, and modern institutions would go through. The move from personal knowledge to systematized metadata. That's where Callimachus's great work, the Pinakes, comes in. Pinakes means tables or lists. That sounds modest, almost clerical. What Callimachus actually did was closer to building an intellectual topography of the Greek-speaking world and of whatever non-Greek texts the library was trying to incorporate. The work itself is lost. What we have are later references, faint quotations, and a general sense of its scope from ancient writers who treated it as a standard tool. From these fragments, we can infer some of its structure. Callimachus seems to have organized the library by genre first: epic poetry, lyric, tragedy, comedy, history, medicine, mathematics, rhetoric, law, and various technical and religious writings. Within each genre, authors were arranged probably alphabetically by name, and under each author individual works were listed. The entries were not just titles. They probably included a brief biographical note, where the author was from, what city they were associated with, who their teachers were. Some entries may have given first lines of works, a crucial way to distinguish between texts that circulated under similar titles. Others may have included comments about authenticity. This play is spurious. This dialogue is not by Plato. This medical treatise is falsely attributed to Hippocrates. In other words, Callimachus wasn't just building a list. He was quietly judging. For a poet like Hesiod, that meant deciding which hymns and didactic works were genuinely his, and which were later imitations. For Hippocrates, it meant sifting through a growing cluster of anonymous medical writings and deciding which ones belonged in the Hippocratic circle, and which were better left floating in anonymity. For Homer, it meant acknowledging that half the Greek world liked to slap his name on any epic or hymn that needed prestige, then pushing back. This is where the Pinakes moves from mere organization to something closer to power. When you decide how to group works, you decide what counts as a genre. When you decide whose biography to record, you decide who counts as an author. When you label a text as authentic, dubious, or anonymous, you influence which texts future scholars will copy, teach, or ignore. Over time, those judgments harden into canons, the real tragedies of Aeschylus, the true works of Democritus, the genuine songs of Sappho. The attributions themselves were not always right. They couldn't be. Scrolls arrived without clear origins. Local traditions disagreed. Some texts were pseudepigraphal from the start, written under prestigious names as a way of giving them weight. Others accumulated false titles as they were recopied, their opening lines mistaken for authors' names, or their content judged Platonic or Aristotelian by later hands. Callimachus had to navigate all of this with the tools available: style, internal clues, hearsay from different cities, earlier lists kept in temples or city archives. His Pinakes, for all its ambition, was still a work of human inference. It solved some problems and created others. A misattribution in his catalogue might echo down centuries, locking a work into the wrong author's orbit. A text he quietly labelled spurious might slip out of circulation altogether. Yet the fact that later scholars in the Roman and Byzantine periods still referred to the Pinakes suggests that the catalogue itself had a life beyond the shelves it described. At some point, at least, parts of it must have been copied and circulated. Excerpts, abridgments, local adaptations, a librarian in Pergamon, a grammarian in Rome, a schoolmaster in Antioch could benefit from Alexandrian labour without ever seeing the original library. In that sense, a catalogue can outlive a collection. The books themselves may rot, burn, disperse into private hands, but the knowledge that these authors existed, these titles were once on a shelf, can migrate into other texts. Biographies, literary histories, scholia, lexica. Even when the Pinakes itself vanished, traces of it probably persisted in later reference works that quietly cannibalized its entries. For modern historians, this creates a haunting asymmetry. We sometimes know that a work once existed because a catalogue or a later author quoting a catalogue tells us so, but we no longer have the work. We know the name of a historian of Alexander, the title of a lost comedy, the bare fact that someone wrote on the revolutions of the stars, and nothing more. This is the tragedy of lost metadata. A scroll is not just words on papyrus. It is a network of context: who wrote it, when, under what circumstances, for which audience, in conversation with which earlier texts. Callimachus tried to capture some of that network in his entries. When those frameworks disappear, the surviving words, if they survive at all, become harder to interpret. Anonymous fragments drift through later anthologies with no clear home. A medical recipe appears in a Byzantine handbook with no author named, and no note that it might once have been part of a larger treatise. A philosophical saying floats free in a Nomelugion, stripped of its original argument. Losing books is one kind of loss. Losing the maps that told you where those books sat, how they related, which ones were trusted, and which ones disputed, that is another, quieter kind. It means that when fragments do reach us, they arrive as orphans. We can still read the words, but the world of relationships that once surrounded them, the vast structure of metadata that Callimachus spent a lifetime building, has mostly dissolved, and yet, even in dissolution, faint outlines remain. A passing mention that Callimachus lists this author among the historians. A note in a later lexicon that, according to the tables in Alexandria, there were 5 plays under this name. These little echoes hint at a time when the library was not just a mass of scrolls, but a mapped, ordered universe of texts. To see what kinds of stars filled that universe, and what limits even the most ambitious catalogue could not erase, we have to look more closely at what was actually on those shelves. If you walked into the main book rooms of the Mouseion, the first impression would not have been exotic mystery. It would have been Greek. The Ptolemies were Macedonian kings ruling an Egyptian land. But their court culture was aggressively Hellenic. Prestige in their world meant Homer, the tragic poets, the lyric canon, the philosophers of Athens and Ionia. So when they sent agents to buy, seize and copy books, those agents were primarily chasing Greek texts. The epic poets came first, multiple copies of Homer in different local recensions, some with extra lines, some with fewer. Rhapsodic texts of the Theban cycle, now mostly vanished. Cyclic epics whose titles we dimly know, Little Iliad, Sack of Ilion, returns, but whose contents are mostly dust. Around them, layers of commentary, scholia explaining obscure words, treatises arguing about which line belonged where, allegorical readings that turned battles into moral lessons. Then the dramatists, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Menander, and the comic poets copied and recopied. Not just the handful of plays that survive now, but the dozens and dozens of tragedies and comedies that later ages let wither. In Alexandria they were still whole, arranged on their shelves under their authors' names, with notes about festival victories, performance history, variant endings. Lyric poets took up their own section: Sappho, Alcaeus, Pindar, Simonides, Bacchylides, collected in books by metre or theme, not by our modern sense of a bound volume, but by rolls containing sets of songs that had once been scattered across the Aegean. Alongside them, anthologies of epigrams, sharp little poems like the ones Callimachus himself wrote, copied from grave stelae, votive offerings and local collections. All of this literary material had a prestige function. To possess everything meant to possess the full Greek canon as it was then imagined, plus the marginal, the obscure, the almost forgotten. The library's scholars used these shelves to edit, compare, and standardize. When later Romans and Byzantines learned their classics, they were often learning Alexandrian versions. But these poetic and philosophical works were only one band in the spectrum. Another wing of the collection held science and mathematics. There were formal treatises, Euclid's Elements, or something close to its evolving form, systematizing geometry, works by Eudoxus and later astronomers, laying out planetary models, handbooks on harmonics, optics, mechanics. Mixed among them were numerical tables, star risings and settings, eclipse records, lengths of shadows at different latitudes, conversion charts for weights, measures and coinage. Some of these were research tools, built in Alexandria itself. Others were copies of earlier Greek work from cities like Miletus, Cnidus and Athens. They formed the raw material for people like Eratosthenes to calculate the circumference of the Earth, and for later astronomers like Hipparchus to refine star catalogues and theories of planetary motion. Close by, you would find prose shelves devoted to history, geography, and ethnography. Long narratives of Greek wars and politics, local chronicles from cities around the Mediterranean, travelogues describing coasts and harbours for sailors. There were periploi, sailing manuals listing ports, distances and landmarks, geographical works that tried to describe the oikoumene, the inhabited world, by stitching together travellers' tales, merchants' reports, and older Near Eastern knowledge. Ethnographic writings described barbarian customs, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with prejudice. Accounts of Persian court ritual, Scythian burial practices, Indian gymnosophists. Administrative knowledge bled invisibly into this realm. Tax regulations, land surveys, census procedures, legal codes. Those might not have been glamorous, but for a dynasty ruling a complex kingdom, having access to earlier models of governance was valuable. Medicine occupied its own substantial domain. Collections of texts attributed to Hippocrates and his followers, anatomical treatises describing bones, veins, and organs as understood before systematic human dissection became common, case histories detailing fevers, wounds, and strange symptoms observed in different climates, pharmacological works listed plants, minerals, and animal products, with notes on preparation and dosage. Here, Egyptian traditions probably mingled with Greek theorizing. Egypt had its own long medical history, recorded in hieratic and demotic scripts on papyrus, centuries before Alexander. Some of that material may have been translated or summarized into Greek, especially recipes and materia medica. Later physicians like Herophilus and Erasistratus, who practiced in Alexandria, drew on both inherited texts and direct observation, producing works that likely sat on those same shelves. This brings us to the non-Greek component of the collection, where claims tend to outrun evidence. In theory, the library aimed to gather books from all the inhabited world. In practice, the main language of scholarship was Greek, Egyptian temple archives, Babylonian astronomical records, Persian royal chronicles, and Hebrew scriptures certainly existed in Alexandria's orbit. Some were probably present as original documents in local archives, others as partial translations or paraphrases. We have reasonably strong traditions that the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek in Alexandria, giving rise to the Septuagint. That suggests at least some direct engagement with Jewish texts. For Egyptian material, priests working under the Ptolemies produced Greek works that presented Egyptian religion and history in Hellenic terms, like Manetho's History of the Pharaohs. Babylonian astronomical data almost certainly seeped into Greek-style lore, perhaps through tables or handbooks adapted into Greek. But the image of a neat row of shelves holding complete Persian literature, Egyptian wisdom, or all the books of the East is almost certainly exaggerated. Translation is slow, expensive, and selective. What made it into Greek would have been what Greek-speaking scholars or administrators found useful: omens, astronomical cycles, royal precedents, theological summaries, occasionally a narrative that seemed edifying or curious. There is another important distinction lurking behind all this abundance: the difference between unique works and widely copied texts. Some scrolls in Alexandria were, as far as we can tell, one-offs: a local chronicle from a small city, a treatise by an obscure philosopher, a ship captain's log turned into a periplus, an Egyptian ritual manual summarized for a single royal project. If those rolls perished, the text likely vanished with them. Others were anything but unique: copies of Homer, the main Attic tragedians, standard handbooks of rhetoric, arithmetic primers, basic medical compilations. These existed in dozens or hundreds of copies across the Greek world. Losing Alexandria's copies would have been a blow, but not an extinction event. Texts that were part of widespread educational and professional curricula had a much better chance of being recopied elsewhere. On the shelves, this difference was invisible. A fragile, soul-surviving account of an eastern voyage might sit next to a sturdy, oft-copied text of Euripides. To the scribe, they were both rolls of papyrus to be dusted and repaired. To us, that invisible hierarchy matters. It means that when we talk about what was lost with the library, we are not talking about a single uniform category of texts, but about a spectrum, from massively duplicated works that survived in other traditions, to solitary voices that, once the papyrus turned to ash or mould, left behind not even a line. If you stayed in those rooms long enough, you would start to notice something else. The shelves were not just storage, they were raw material. Alexandria was one of the first places where people made a systematic practice out of doubting their own texts. That sounds almost paradoxical for a library. You gather the books, then you immediately start questioning them. But that is exactly what the Alexandrian philologists did. Take Homer. By the time of the early Ptolemies, there was no single original Iliad or Odyssey. There were local versions in different cities, performance traditions, rhapsodes, who improvised or substituted lines. The Alexandrian scholars, Zenodotus, Aristophanes of Byzantium, Aristarchus, took these messy living poems and tried to pin them down. They compared copies line by line. They marked verses they thought suspicious with tiny critical signs in the margins. An obolos, a little horizontal line, to indicate this line is probably spurious. An asterisk to pair similar passages. Dots and curved marks to signal pauses, tone, or variant readings. Alongside the main text, they wrote commentaries explaining dialect forms, mythological references, why one variant should be preferred over another. Most of their own treatises are gone. What we have are echoes, Byzantine scholia repeating Alexandrian opinions, scraps of papyri showing these signs already in use. But the method survives, modern textual criticism, deciding between readings, reconstructing lost archetypes, signalling uncertainty, starts here with librarians who were willing to say, this line of Homer might not be Homer at all. That same habit of mind, organized doubt, disciplined comparison, also shaped their work on the physical world. Eratosthenes, who at one point was both head of the library and royal tutor, is the emblem of this. His famous estimate of the Earth's circumference depended on two things: scattered observations and an institution that could gather and coordinate them. He had reports that at Syene in southern Egypt on the summer solstice, the sun at noon shone straight down a deep well, casting no shadow. In Alexandria, on the same date, vertical objects did cast a shadow. From that difference in angle, and an assumed distance between the two cities, he inferred the size of the globe. The geometry and outline is simple enough that it appears in school textbooks today. But beneath it lies an institutional story. To even imagine the question, Eratosthenes needed access to earlier geographical writings, to travel accounts, to records of distances along the Nile, to Babylonian and Greek astronomy. He needed scribes to copy tables, assistants to check dates, a royal household willing to support a scholar whose work would not pay off in this year's harvest. The Mouseion made that possible. It allowed what we might call long-range thinking, projects whose only immediate product was understanding. Astronomy in Alexandria grew in the same soil. Precise observation of the sky was not just a philosophical hobby. It mattered for cult and for kingship. Temple festivals were tied to lunar cycles and stellar risings. Navigators depended on predictable star paths. Bureaucrats needed reliable calendars to time tax collection and grain shipments. So scholars compiled star catalogues, recorded eclipses, noted the first appearance of bright stars at dawn. They experimented with models of planetary motion, trying to save the phenomena with circles and epicycles. Some of this work drew on centuries of Near Eastern records that had been translated or adapted. Some was fresh observation from Egyptian skies. Calendrical reform was one outcome. The Ptolemaic administration adopted and then struggled to fully implement a more rational solar calendar that smoothed out the old drift of festival dates through the seasons. Behind that change lay tables, calculations, arguments in treatises we mostly no longer have. Geometry and mechanics formed another strand. Euclid's Elements, compiled perhaps just before or during the early Alexandrian period, systematized plane and solid geometry into a deductive structure. Later mathematicians in Alexandria extended this, not only for its own sake, but for engineering. Siege engines, water-lifting devices, harbour works, lighthouse design, all of these drew, in one way or another, on geometrical and mechanical knowledge. Some texts were highly abstract, proving the properties of conic sections or proportions. Others were practical manuals, describing how to measure land accurately, how to calculate the volume of a granary, how to balance a lever. Again, most titles are names to us, preserved in later references. The actual roles have disintegrated, yet the habits they embodied, the explicit proof, the diagram, the worked example survived by imitation. Later mathematicians wrote, in the style of their Alexandrian predecessors, even when the originals were gone. That is one of the quiet themes of this place, the survival of methods when the specific scrolls fail. When we reconstruct an Alexandrian edition of Homer, when we use critical sigla in modern dictionaries, when we treat a text as something to be collated and corrected, we are echoing their philology. When we assume the earth is measurable, that angles and distances can turn into a number describing the planet, we are inhabiting a world that Eratosthenes helped define. When we trust that a complex machine can be analysed into levers, pulleys and forces that can be calculated, we are standing in the shadow of their geometry. Behind all of this were people, as prone to rivalry and fatigue as any modern academics. Direct testimony is sparse, but later stories suggest sharp debates over priority: who first proposed a reading, who measured a star, whose model of the planets was more accurate. Some scholars were mocked for pedantry, others were accused of plagiarism. Patrons could favour one faction over another. Reputation mattered. So did the quiet, repetitive work, reading variant copies of the same text, checking numbers in long tables, correcting a scribe's slip. Most days in the library were probably not dramatic. They were days of routine, unrolling and re-rolling papyri, sharpening reeds, arguing about a single word in a hexameter, checking the height of the sun against a gnomon. Yet from those routines emerged patterns that outlasted regimes and buildings. The scrolls will vanish, one by one, in fires, in damp, in neglect. But the idea that text can be edited, that the world can be measured, that the sky can be mapped and predicted, that way of working, once invented, is hard to kill. All of this work depended on something almost embarrassingly fragile. Papyrus looks solid when you picture it, neat rolls, tied with cords, stacked in orderly slots. But as a material, it sits right on the edge between endurance and decay. Under the right conditions, dry air, stable temperature, darkness, it can last for centuries, even millennia. Under the wrong ones, it simply rots back into the plant fibres it came from. The Egyptians, long before Alexandria, had already discovered this. In tombs sealed away from light and moisture, papyrus survives like time in a jar. In the damp of the Nile Delta, it disappears. Alexandria, with its sea breezes, harbour mists and crowded urban humidity, was much closer to the delta than to the desert. So the longevity of a scroll in the library was never an inherent property. It was a negotiated truce with the environment, shelving in interior rooms, attempts at ventilation without too much open air, careful handling so the fibres did not crack. These were constant low-level battles against entropy. Fire, of course, is the dramatic enemy. Flames leaping from stack to stack, shelves collapsing, smoke carrying ashes into the night. That image is powerful because it is simple, but for most scrolls that ever existed, the end was quieter. A slight leak in the roof during a winter storm, water stains creeping into the lower edges of rolls stored too close to the floor, mould blooming in spots you cannot see until you unroll the text and find letters blurred, fibres soft and pulpy. A clerk sets the damaged copies aside, intending to have them recopied. Then the day gets busy. Another year goes by. Another. Insects are indifferent to cultural achievement. A papyrus roll is just compact plant matter, perfect for larvae and nesting. Rodents will gnaw through bindings and wrappings to get at grains and chew through texts along the way. Even human hands are part of the problem. Every unrolling and re-rolling adds micro-damage. Edges fray, outer layers crack, little pieces flake off onto the floor, swept away with the dust. This is why the real engine of textual survival has almost never been storage. It has been copying. A roll that is never copied is a roll that is already dying. Alexandria, at its height, understood this. Scribes were not just producing new acquisitions. They were replacing damaged exemplars, creating clean copies of works that were fraying or that had accumulated too many marginal corrections. But copying is expensive. It takes trained labour, ink, space, time. Decisions have to be made. What deserves a new copy? What can limp along a little longer? What no one is asking for anymore? Popular authors are safe, obscure treatises are not. The churn of reproduction creates a bias. Some genres, Homeric poetry, medical handbooks, basic mathematical texts, get recopied again and again. Others fall off the schedule. The institution's health matters as much as the climate. When royal subsidies are steady, the copying rooms are busy, repairs are made, storage improved. When budgets tighten, maintenance is the first thing to go. Shelves warp and are not replaced. A damaged roof section is patched temporarily, then left. Scribes are reassigned to more urgent administrative tasks. The library is still there, the scrolls are still there, but the quiet, preventive care slips. Politics seeps in as well. A new ruler with different interests might favour some branches of study over others. Theology, royal propaganda, practical manuals for administration could be prioritised. Speculative philosophy or obscure dialect poetry might not. A catalogue entry remains. The physical roll behind it quietly decays. From the inside, this is just drift, a slow narrowing of what is actively maintained. From the outside, looking back centuries later, the record is patchy. We know, or think we know, that a certain author was in the library. We no longer see the incremental steps by which his work stopped being recopied, perhaps long before any visible disaster. This is one reason why dramatic stories gain so much traction. A single great fire, a definitive sack, an edict that condemns the shelves. These are satisfying explanations for a pattern of absence. It is easier to imagine everything perishing in one night than to imagine 300 years of roof leaks, rodents, budget cuts, and shifting tastes in reading. Some of the later accounts of Alexandria's destruction may be, in part, memory, doing this kind of work, compressing long sequences of neglect, piecemeal damage, and partial clear-outs into a single emblematic event. The catastrophe stands in for a whole ecology of fragility. Archaeology can help us see some of this, but only in outline. In very dry environments we find entire archives preserved, letters, receipts, school exercises that show what an ordinary collection looks like when time stops suddenly. In more humid places like coastal Egypt, we very rarely find papyri in situ from great libraries. Instead, we find reused scraps in mummy cartonnage, charred fragments in rubbish heaps, the ghostly impressions of shelving cut into walls. From these traces we can infer practices of storage, repair, discarding. We can see that texts circulated, were copied, were reused as packing material when no longer wanted. What we cannot do is point to an empty room and say with certainty, here once were 50,000 rolls, now vanished without a trace. So when we think of Alexandria's books, it is helpful to imagine not only the spectacular threats, fire from ships in the harbour, riots in the streets, but the daily unremarkable enemies: damp, heat, insects, inattention. Most losses were probably not cinematic. They were silent. A scroll unconsulted for a century. A title still listed in a catalogue, long after its last physical copy had crumbled away. By the time the famous fires and battles arrive in our story, much of what the early Ptolemies gathered may already have slipped out of existence in this slow, ordinary way. The later flames would land on a landscape that time had already been quietly clearing. By the time Julius Caesar arrived, Alexandria was not a quiet city of scholars gently tending shelves. It was a battleground in a civil war that had started far away, in Rome, and then spilled over into Egypt. You were in 48 BCE. Caesar is chasing his rival Pompey across the Mediterranean. Pompey flees to Egypt, hoping for support from the young king Ptolemy XIII and his court. Instead, he is murdered on the shore, his head presented to Caesar as a gruesome gesture of loyalty. The gesture backfires. Caesar is disgusted, but he stays. And by staying, he becomes entangled in Egypt's own dynastic struggle between Ptolemy and his sister Cleopatra. Alexandria at this point is a royal capital with factions, soldiers, mercenaries, and a nervous population watching foreign legions land in the harbour. Caesar's forces are badly outnumbered. They take up positions near the royal quarter and the great harbour. The Ptolemaic army blocks them from the mainland. Control of the waterfront becomes the difference between survival and defeat. In such a situation, fires in port areas are not exotic or unlikely. Ships are wooden, tarred, and loaded with rope, sails, oil, grain. Harbour installations, warehouses, sheds, granaries are crammed with combustible material. Defenders and attackers both know that burning ships can block a harbour, deny supplies, or force an enemy to abandon advantageous positions. Ancient sources tell us that Caesar, in desperate circumstances, ordered ships in the harbour to be set on fire to prevent them from being captured or used against him. Flames spread from the burning fleet to buildings along the waterfront. That much in broad strokes is plausible and consistent with how urban warfare often worked in ancient port cities. Then we reach the gap between what we would like to know and what the texts actually say. Our earliest accounts, Caesar's own writings and those of close contemporaries like Cicero, are strikingly quiet about a library catastrophe. Caesar talks about the fighting in Alexandria, the danger, the fires in the harbour. He does not pause to mourn shelves of scrolls. Cicero never launches into a lament about the loss of the world's greatest library at Caesar's hands. For writers so ready to use rhetorical flourishes, that silence is meaningful. Later authors, writing generations or even centuries after the events, start to introduce the idea that the fire damaged books. Plutarch, in the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, mentions that the flames from Caesar's ships burned storehouses by the harbour that contained many books. Strabo, who actually lived in Alexandria in the generation after the Civil War, describes the Mouseion and its library in the present tense, as though they still exist. He does not write like a man walking through the ruins of a recently annihilated institution. If we line these testimonies up, a pattern emerges. The clear, near-contemporary evidence points to fires in the harbour area, likely damaging warehouses and adjacent buildings. Later evidence, more distant in time, begins to associate those fires with large numbers of scrolls. But no ancient author we can securely date close to 48 BCE describes the main library complex, within the royal quarter, going up in flames and never recovering. This is where historians begin to separate probabilities. One likely scenario is that the fire reached storage facilities near the port, warehouses where newly acquired books or duplicate copies waiting to be processed were stored. Alexandria's book acquisition machine probably involved staging areas, bales of papyrus, crates of imported texts, bundles of rolls seized from incoming ships before being copied and returned. If those spaces burned, thousands of rolls could have been lost in a single chaotic episode, without the core library buildings themselves being destroyed. This would also help explain later numbers. Some ancient authors, well after the fact, speak of tens of thousands of books being burned, or throw out very large figures as part of more general descriptions of the library's holdings. Once a great many scrolls are said to have been lost in a fire. Later retellings are free to round up, to conflate estimates of the library's total size with losses in a single incident, to turn a serious but localized disaster into a total annihilation. Numbers that might have begun as rough guesses, 40,000, 400,000, 700,000, start to circulate as if they were counts taken at the door on the last day. Copyists repeat them, compilers mix them, modern writers encounter them as if they were measurements, not rhetorical devices. If the damage was indeed concentrated in harbour warehouses and shipments, what would that have meant in practice? It would have been a blow, but not necessarily a death sentence. Alexandria's collection was not a single master copy of each text. It was a layered system of exemplars, duplicates, working copies, special editions for scholars, perhaps even schoolroom sets for teaching. Losing a batch of rolls in transit or a cache of duplicates would reduce redundancy. It would narrow the margin of safety for certain works. Some titles that were rare already might have tipped over the edge and vanished. Others, still present in the main stacks or in private collections, could be recopied over time. In other words, a partial loss in 48 BCE fits with what we know about gradual attrition. It accelerates the quiet processes of decay and neglect, but it does not erase everything. The fact that Strabo can still describe the Mouseion afterwards, that later scholars still refer to Alexandrian editions and editorial work, suggests continuity of some kind. Wounded, perhaps, but alive. So why did this episode become the star of the story, the moment everyone remembers? Partly because Caesar is a convenient protagonist. His name is large, his life well documented, his presence in Alexandria tied to high drama, love affairs with Cleopatra, sieges, burning ships. To say Caesar burned the library is to anchor a vague, dispersed history of loss onto a single famous individual at a precise, cinematic moment. It also fits a narrative people find emotionally satisfying. The idea that one man's ambition, one military gamble, snuffed out centuries of accumulated knowledge in a single night, gives shape to a much more complicated reality. Instead of countless anonymous choices, budgets cut, copies not made, scrolls left in damp rooms, we get a clear villain and a clear disaster. In the end, the harbour fire of 48 BCE was almost certainly real and almost certainly destructive. It probably consumed ships, buildings, stores of grain and goods, and yes, some quantities of books. But the image of the entire Library of Alexandria turning to ash in that single blaze is, as far as our evidence goes, a later simplification layered over a patchier truth. The scrolls that died in Caesar's fire were part of a longer story, one episode in a series of injuries, recoveries, and quiet abandonments that would reshape the library over the next 3 centuries. When the flames went out and the smoke drifted away over the harbour, Alexandria's scholars, or what remained of them, still had shelves to tend, catalogues to consult, and decisions to make about what, in their changed world, was worth copying again. When the fighting finally stopped, Alexandria did what cities usually do after catastrophe. It swept up the ashes, counted the dead, and went back to work. The Roman Republic, soon to be the Roman Empire, had no interest in letting one of the wealthiest ports in the Mediterranean remain a smouldering ruin. Grain still had to move, taxes still had to be collected, and for Egyptian rulers who now owed their thrones to Roman support, the trappings of culture and learning were part of the price of staying respectable. So, in the first generations after Caesar, we don't see a silence where Alexandria used to be. We see signs of continued scholarship. Strabo, who walked the city under Augustus, talks about the Mouseion as a functioning institution, not as a legend from the good old days, but as something you could still visit. Later, under the early emperors, we hear of grammarians, mathematicians, and doctors working in Alexandria, arguing over texts, producing commentaries, teaching students. Titles like Alexandrian edition of a poem or treatise still meant something. They still carried prestige. That continuity matters. It suggests that whatever damage Caesar's fire caused, the idea of Alexandria as a place of books and learning was resilient. The shelves might have been thinned, the budgets might have shrunk, but the basic pattern, royal or imperial money, paying for scholars to sit in buildings, argue about texts, and write more texts, persisted. At the same time, the ground under those scholars' feet was shifting. Under the Ptolemies, the library had been the showpiece of a kingdom trying to impress the Greek-speaking world. Under Rome, it became one cultural asset among many, in a sprawling empire with its own priorities. Some emperors liked this kind of thing. Augustus and his successors built public libraries in Rome, collected Greek and Latin authors, appointed learned men to oversee collections. For them, Alexandrian scholarship was a resource, a brand they could plug into a wider imperial project. Others were less enthusiastic. Provincial institutions were expensive. Patronage could be redirected. A city that had once been at the very edge of royal attention might now find itself competing for funds with libraries in Pergamon, Athens, or Rome itself. Local elites had to step in more often, paying for chairs in rhetoric, endowing teachers, sponsoring copies of fashionable texts. This created a tug-of-war. On one side, imperial patronage, occasional grants, honours, or appointments that kept the scholarly ecosystem alive. On the other, slow local decline as buildings aged, papyrus decayed, and no king felt personally responsible for keeping every shelf full. But knowledge in the Roman Mediterranean was no longer concentrated in just one place. It was distributed through a widening network. Alongside the great state library in the palace precinct, there were temple archives holding ritual texts and community records. There were collections in Roman-style public baths and gymnasia. Wealthy households in Alexandria and beyond kept their own libraries. Shelves of Homer, Plato, medical treatises, rhetorical handbooks, technical manuals on architecture, engineering and agriculture. Letters and inscriptions from the empire remind us that being an educated elite meant owning books. Governors carried portable libraries from post to post. Philosophers travelled with chests of scrolls. Teachers of rhetoric compiled anthologies of famous passages to use in class. Copyists, both professional and amateur, moved texts from one city to another as gifts, fees, or investments in a child's education. In this world, Alexandria's library becomes less a single building and more a tradition, a style of scholarship, a body of edited texts, a way of organizing and citing knowledge. When a teacher in Antioch or Rome used an Alexandrian reading of Homer, they were, in a sense, still drawing from that original collection, even if the scroll they held had never been within sight of the Pharos. Survival begins to look different too. Instead of imagining intact shelves of unique works, think of fragments woven into new forms. Excerpts copied into anthologies of best lines, shortened versions of plays or histories, tailored for school use. Commentaries that quoted long passages of older authors in order to explain them. Technical digests that summarized longer treatises, keeping key rules and procedures while discarding digressive detail. A book that disappeared from the main collection might live on in the margins of another book, in a teacher's handbook, or in a student's exercise. A historian's massive multi-volume history might be too unwieldy to copy whole, but choice episodes, famous speeches, dramatic battles, could circulate in abridged versions for centuries. This is the quiet shift that defines the early Roman period in Alexandria. The age of ambitious, almost indiscriminate collecting, everything from everywhere, gives way to an age of selection. What gets copied now is what people actually use, texts needed for education, for court speeches, for medicine, for astronomy, for astrology, for religious ritual, poetry that remains popular, philosophical works that fit current fashions, handbooks that save time. From a distance it can look like loss. The wild diversity of the early library narrows into a canon, a set of preferred authors and standard editions. But it's also a survival strategy. In a world where papyrus is fragile and copying is laborious, attention becomes the main preservative. What people read, teach, argue about, that is what endures. Alexandria's role after Caesar is to help define that canon and feed that network. Less a perfect vault of everything ever written, and more a powerful current in the larger river of Roman book culture, still flowing but already branching, thinning and choosing its path. By the early Roman period, that river of book culture in Alexandria had more than one channel. One of the strangest and most misunderstood is the Serapeum. The Serapeum was not a dusty annex tucked quietly behind the main library. It was one of the great showpieces of the city, perched on the so-called Acropolis Hill. It dominated the southwest quarter. It was a temple to Serapis, a god who was himself a kind of fusion, part Egyptian, part Greek, invented by the early Ptolemies as a religious glue for their new kingdom. So you have a towering religious complex, with courtyards, colonnades, priests, processions, altars, statues, a place where the city went to perform its identity in public. That alone makes it a natural home for texts. In the ancient world, temples were not just places to pray. They were archives, treasuries, schools, law offices, and community centres, all layered together. When ancient writers mention the Serapeum, they sometimes talk about books. A few late sources speak of a daughter library there, a secondary collection linked in memory to the Great Library of the Mouseion. Earlier hints suggest that at least some texts were kept in or near the temple precinct, works needed for rituals, for astrology, for philosophical teaching, for the priest's own study. But what exactly was this daughter library? Here the evidence becomes thin, and we have to tread carefully. One influential story, repeated in later antiquity, claims that after some great loss at the main library, sometimes Caesar's fire, sometimes a different disaster, surviving books were moved to the Serapeum, or that a parallel collection there took over its functions. The Serapeum, in this telling, becomes a kind of backup drive, the branch that saves the day when the headquarters burns. It's a satisfying image. It gives the narrative of loss a dramatic second act. The problem is that our sources don't line up cleanly. When we look closely, the evidence points less to a clearly organised branch library with official continuity and more to something looser, a large, prestigious temple complex that happened over time to accumulate books. Imagine a spectrum. On one end you have the Ptolemaic Mouseion, a state-sponsored research institute with salaried scholars and an explicit mission to collect, catalogue and edit texts. That is a library in a strong institutional sense. On the other end you have a typical city temple with a modest archive, contracts, dedications, ritual formulas, maybe a few commentaries. The Serapeum seems to sit somewhere in the middle, grand enough and cosmopolitan enough that it could host philosophical lectures and serve as a meeting place for learned circles, religious enough that it kept its own archives and ritual texts, embedded enough in the social life of the city that wealthy donors might give books as offerings or sponsor rooms for teaching, that starts to look less like a branch library and more like what you might call a symbolic library of the city, not a catalogued extension of the royal shelves, but a node where many of the city's intellectual currents met: religion, philosophy, astrology, rhetoric, local administration. Later authors, looking back through centuries of memory and legend, may have blurred the distinctions. To a writer in the 3rd or 4th century, the Library of Alexandria had become less a precise institution and more a mythic label. If you knew there had once been a famous library in the Bruchian district, and you also knew that the Serapeum was a famous place where books and philosophers could be found, it was easy, maybe inevitable, to blend them. One text mentions books destroyed with the Serapeum and assumes those were the last remnants of the Great Library. Another describes a collection at the Serapeum and calls it part of the libraries at Alexandria, as if there were one coherent entity with several wings. Over time, separate institutions with different histories and functions collapsed into a single story: the rise and fall of the library. So what might actually have been sitting on shelves at the Serapeum during its long life under the Romans? Probably not the unique, one-of-a-kind treasures of early Ptolemaic collecting. Those, if they survived at all, would have been scattered long before. But we can infer some likely categories. Temple business required records, land grants, donations, legal decisions, accounts. Ritual required manuals, hymns, calendars of festivals, lists of offerings, instructions for processions, astrological tables to fix auspicious dates. Teaching required handbooks, introductions to philosophy, compendia of doctrines, collections of authoritative excerpts. Students and lecturers likely used the Serapeum's precinct as a space to meet and study. That implies shelves of standard works: Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, rhetorical manuals, commentaries on Homer and tragedy, mathematical and astronomical treatises useful for astrology. In other words, the same kinds of texts that circulated in other educational centres of the empire, just concentrated in a particularly prominent sacred setting. Copies, not autographs. Reference works, not raw archival deposits of every papyrus scrap the kingdom had ever hoarded. Practical texts for teaching and ritual, not necessarily the obscure local histories or experimental poems that had once filled out the Ptolemaic shelves. This uncertainty about the Serapeum's book holdings isn't just an academic quibble. It changes how we think about what was truly lost and what had a chance to survive. If we imagine the Serapeum as the last vault containing the only copies of thousands of ancient works, then its later destruction looks like an almost total cultural amputation. If instead we see it as one important node in a much wider network, holding mostly standard, frequently copied texts, plus some local archives, then its fall is still tragic, but not necessarily apocalyptic for the broader tradition. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The Serapeum likely preserved some local documents, and particular copies that went no further. Those are gone, silently. It also almost certainly housed many works that existed simultaneously in other libraries and private collections around the Mediterranean. Those could continue their lives elsewhere, even if Alexandria's shelves fell. And this is why the sparse evidence around the daughter library matters. It reminds us to resist neat endings. There was no single moment when someone slammed a door and turned off the lights on all of ancient knowledge. There were overlapping institutions, like the Mouseion and the Serapeum, whose stories intersected and then diverged. Their shelves thinned and replenished at different times. Their functions shifted with politics, with patronage, with fashion. Later authors, looking for a simple tale of rise and fall, merged them into one. To understand what really survived, we have to peel those layers apart again, and follow the books not as a single block, but as a swarm of texts moving through temples, schools, houses, and city archives. And that swarm was about to face new kinds of danger, not from one dramatic fire, but from centuries of urban crisis, war, and slow neglect. By the middle of the 3rd century, the world around Alexandria had started to come apart. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Frontiers collapsed. Plagues moved through cities already strained by taxation and military requisition. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century, but for people living inside it, it must have felt less like a crisis and more like a long, grinding unravelling. Alexandria, for all its grandeur, was not insulated from this. It was a strategic asset. It controlled grain routes from the Nile to the Mediterranean. It housed key imperial garrisons. It was a naval base, a customs hub, a financial centre, and a restless, fractious metropolis with a history of riots and local strongmen. In calmer centuries, that combination made it rich and cosmopolitan. In a century of civil war, it made it a prize and a target. When we talk about the fate of Alexandrian scholarship in this period, it helps to step away from images of a quiet library with monks dusting shelves and picture instead a fortified city that keeps getting dragged into imperial power struggles. There are revolts and sieges under emperors like Gallienus. There are local claimants to imperial authority. One of the most famous is Zenobia of Palmyra, whose forces seize Egypt in the 260s. Controlling Alexandria is essential to her bid for power. Regaining it is essential for Rome. Enter Aurelian. Around 272 CE, the Emperor Aurelian marches east to crush the Palmyrene breakaway. Part of that campaign is the reconquest of Egypt and, crucially, Alexandria. Our sources are fragmentary, but they agree on a few key points. There is hard fighting in the city. The emperor's forces assault rebel positions. The so-called Brutian district, the old royal quarter where the Ptolemaic court and, earlier, the Mouseion had stood, shows up in the texts as a locus of destruction. Later writers even say Aurelian destroyed it. What does that mean in practice? Not necessarily a methodical levelling of every building, and certainly not a targeted expedition to burn books. Generals do not typically storm cities in order to visit their libraries, but street-by-street fighting does a particular kind of damage. You get buildings burned because they are strong points, warehouses emptied to feed troops, houses looted because soldiers need pay. Wealthy neighbourhoods suffer because that's where the valuables are. Administrative buildings are torn up for firewood, barricades, or simply because no one is left to maintain them. In that kind of urban warfare, archives die in quiet ways. A chest of documents is carried off with other booty and broken up for its wooden frame. A room of scrolls is abandoned when its stewards flee, then slowly eaten by damp and insects. A temple precinct that once funded philosophical lectures can no longer pay staff, and the teaching circle dissolves. No one is there to care if the bookroom leaks. We don't have a report that says Aurelian burned the library. What we have instead is a pattern, a crucial intellectual quarter of the city described as ruined in the wake of his reconquest, and almost complete silence thereafter about any grand, centrally supported library institution in that area. This is where the idea of cumulative damage becomes important. Institutions, especially ones built around fragile media like Papyrus, rarely fail because of one single theatrical catastrophe. They fail because they are hit, over and over, by shocks they cannot quite absorb. Imagine the life of a scholarly community in Alexandria from the 2nd to the 3rd century. First, there is a slow drift of imperial patronage away from the old Hellenistic institutions. Money that once funded resident scholars goes instead to other cities, other projects. Salaries shrink, chairs go unfilled. The best minds of the generation may move to Rome, to Antioch, to new centres of power. Then come local troubles, civic unrest, religious tensions, occasional crackdowns. Each episode scatters some teachers, closes some schools, interrupts some copying projects. Then war literally walks into the city, more than once. Every time, some part of the infrastructure of learning takes a hit. A scriptorium shutters, a small archive is pillaged. A private collector flees with part of his library and leaves the rest to chance. A patron who might have sponsored copying or cataloguing diverts his wealth into survival. None of these losses taken alone is the end of the Library of Alexandria. Together, stretched over decades, they thin out shelves, break chains of transmission, and perhaps most importantly, shrink the human network that gives texts their meaning. The record hints at this contraction. We still hear of Alexandrian intellectuals in the 3rd century, but fewer of them, and with narrower roles. Instead of grand state-supported polymaths at the Mouseion, we meet individual grammarians, rhetors, and Christian theologians teaching in more modest settings, private houses, small schools, churches. The city is not suddenly stupid. It is, however, differently organised. Scholarship is less a public imperial project and more a patchwork of local efforts. This is why the crisis of the 3rd century matters for the story of the library, even though no single source tells us, here on this date, the library ceased to exist. By the time you have half a century of military upheaval, economic strain, and political fragmentation, an institution that relies on surplus wealth, long-term planning, and stable patronage is in trouble. Even if walls and shelves survive, the ecosystem that kept them stocked and curated may not. Later generations, trying to make sense of this slow crumbling, prefer cleaner stories. A single fire, a named villain, a last day. It is easier to imagine all the scrolls perishing at once in Aurelian's Reconquest or under some later emperor than to picture a more ordinary tragedy. Bookrooms left unattended, scholars migrating away, unpaid staff selling off volumes, and papyrus quietly rotting in the humidity of a city whose priorities have shifted to defence and bread. The legend of one great burning acts like a magnifying glass. It focuses centuries of attrition into a single point of flame. But the historical record points us towards something less cinematic and more familiar. Cultural institutions worn down by repeated shocks. War, plague, fiscal crisis, urban violence, each impact small enough perhaps to survive, together enough to tip a precarious balance. By the time the 3rd century draws to a close, Alexandria is still a major city. It still has teachers, archives, temples, and, as we'll see, increasingly influential Christian communities. But the idea of a unified city defining Library of Alexandria, in the old Ptolemaic sense, has probably already dissolved. What remains are fragments, smaller collections, specialized archives, private libraries, temple bookrooms like the one at the Serapeum. Those fragments will face their own trials in the coming centuries. And once again, Later storytellers will look for a single dramatic moment to stand in for a long, complicated decline. By the late 4th century, Alexandria had a new fault line running through it. Not just Greek versus Egyptian or Jew versus Gentile or rich versus poor. Those tensions were still there, but layered over them was something sharper, Christian versus pagan, with imperial law now taking sides. The emperors of this period, especially Theodosius I, issue a series of edicts that change the rules of the game. Public sacrifice is banned, funding for traditional cults is cut off, temples lose legal protections and in many cases their income. Officials who once oversaw sacrifices now have to enforce their prohibition. On paper this is about religion. In practice, in a city like Alexandria, it is also about power. Temples are not just places of worship. They are landholders, employers, lenders, and often owners of libraries and schools. To weaken them is to rewire the city's economy and its intellectual life. The Serapeum sits right in the crosshairs of this transformation. Perched on the southwestern hill of the city, it has been for centuries one of Alexandria's great landmarks, a temple complex dedicated to Serapis, a god deliberately designed in the Hellenistic period to bridge Greek and Egyptian traditions. Around it grew a whole ecosystem: priests, philosophers, scribes, and, at some point, a book collection that later writers call a daughter library. By the late 4th century, that world is under pressure from both directions. On one side, Christian bishops are building their own institutions, churches, charities, schools of theology, and competing for prestige. On the other, imperial decrees are stripping the old cults of legal and financial support. Riots and street fights between factions are not rare events. They are part of Alexandria's normal weather. Our main narrative of what happens next comes from Christian sources, especially the church historians Sozomen and the Bishop Rufinus. Their story unfolds like this. There is violence between Christians and pagans. Some Christians are killed and, according to these accounts, their bodies are taken into the Serapeum. In response, imperial authority intervenes. The prefect and the bishop, Theophilus, in most versions, receive orders, grant amnesty to the pagans if they give up the temple, destroy the idols, close the place down. The texts linger on certain details. They describe the statue of Serapis being toppled, its head broken off and carried through the streets. They talk about altars smashed, cult images defaced, the ground being levelled even to the foundations. They recount the humiliation of a defeated god. What they do not dwell on is also telling. There is no vivid set piece of book burnings, no catalogue of scrolls dragged out and set alight, no triumphant list of authors whose works are now consigned to the flames. In writers who are otherwise eager to frame this as a total victory over pagan superstition, the silence about texts is striking. That doesn't mean there were no books there. It means that, if there were, their fate did not interest the people telling the story in the way the destruction of images did. So, what is likely to have happened to any remaining collections at the Serapeum? By this point, remember, the grand, centrally funded model of the old Mouseion is long gone. A library at the Serapeum is probably a temple bookroom, a mix of liturgical texts, theological treatises, philosophical works, maybe some technical manuals kept for use by a shrinking priestly and scholarly circle that has already endured decades of austerity. When a complex like that is targeted, books can follow several paths, most of them unglamorous. Some are removed in advance. Priests, philosophers, or simply book lovers with means see the writing on the wall, literally in the form of imperial edicts, and quietly transfer prized volumes into private houses, country estates, or allied temples. A cherished Plato manuscript becomes the centerpiece of a gentleman's study rather than a public resource. Some are confiscated rather than destroyed, Christian leaders and imperial officials are not indifferent to texts. They are perfectly capable of seeing value in medical, astronomical, or rhetorical works, even if they reject the cult that housed them. Scrolls might be taken into new Christian schools, bishops' libraries, or civic archives, stripped of their old ritual context, but preserved as useful knowledge. Some are simply reused. Papyrus is a commodity. In a city where resources are always in demand, an old roll might be scraped and overwritten, turned into a legal register, a sermon collection, or a student's exercise book. Others might be cut up for wrapping, wicks, or stuffing in mummy cases. From the point of view of a 4th century scribe, this is recycling, not sacrilege. Some are neglected. Once the institution that cared for them is dissolved, rooms that held books might stand open to the weather, or be repurposed as storage or squatted in. Damp, insects and rats do the work that fire never has to do. Within a few decades, the physical traces of a collection can vanish without ever having become a pile of ash. And some are selectively preserved, not because they are pagan, but because they intersect with the curriculum of the rising Christian schools. This is where educational change becomes crucial. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the core of elite education across the empire is still based on classical authors. Students learn to read and speak Greek by copying Homer, Demosthenes, Euripides, and later rhetoricians. Christian teachers criticize some content, argue with it, reframe it, but they also depend on it to train their students in the skills of argument and style. That means texts that fit this curriculum are the ones most often recopied in monastic scriptoria and private schools. Others, no matter how brilliant, are not refreshed onto new parchment. They fade out, not because they were dramatically burned, but because no one sees enough use in them to justify the labour of copying. In this light, the popular image, when the Christians destroyed the Serapeum, they burned the last books of the Library of Alexandria, compresses many processes into a single emotionally satisfying event. It tells a moral story, enlightened science snuffed out by fanaticism. It identifies a clear villain and a clean ending, but the evidence we have is thinner and messier. We know of iconoclasm, statues toppled, altars broken. We know of political struggles, bishops jockeying with prefects, mobs staking claims in the streets. We know that the Serapeum, as a functioning temple, is shut down. We do not have a contemporaneous report that says, "This is the day the last Alexandrian books were burned." What we can see instead is a shift in infrastructure. Temples lose their financial base, churches gain it. Traditional philosophical schools tied to cult centres wither, Christian catechetical and monastic schools grow. The copying labour that once flowed through places like the Serapeum is redirected into new channels. Under those conditions, destruction is often less about bonfires and more about redirected attention. A scroll that is no longer useful to anyone's teaching or preaching does not need to be ceremonially incinerated. It only needs to be left on a shelf that no one dusts, in a building no one repairs, in a city that has other priorities. The drama of statues crashing to the ground makes it into the histories. The slow, silent death of Papyrus does not. Separating these layers, iconoclasm from logistics, moral narratives from material realities, lets us tell a different kind of story about the end of pagan Alexandria. Not one last perfect blaze consuming all that was left of a legendary library, but a long reallocation of resources and attention in which some texts quietly cross the religious boundary into Christian scriptoria, some vanish into private collections, some are cannibalized for their writing surface, and many simply fail to be renewed. By the time later writers look back, that complex process has hardened into legend. It is easier to say the Christians burned the library than to explain how educational syllabi, budget lines, and humidity did their work over generations. And yet, While some works surely ended there, others were already travelling new routes, through Christian schools, through monastic libraries, through translations that would carry part of Alexandria's intellectual DNA far beyond the ruined terraces of the Serapeum. By the time Arab armies approached Alexandria in the 7th century, the legend of a single unified Great Library was already more memory than institution. Yet this is where one of the most famous stories lands. You may have heard it in some version like this: the Arab general Amr ibn al-As conquers Alexandria. He writes to the Caliph Umar asking what to do with the city's enormous libraries. The Caliph replies with a chillingly neat formula: if the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are dangerous. In either case, burn them. The books are supposedly used as fuel to heat the city's bathhouses for months. It's a cinematic ending. It gives us a single command, a single villain, and a line of dialogue that seems made for posters and documentaries. It also appears nowhere in our earliest sources for the Conquest. The story surfaces centuries later in Arabic and Syriac writers who are far removed from the first generation of conquerors. Their works are not battlefield reports or administrative archives. They are often collections of anecdotes, moral tales, or theological polemics. This is where source criticism matters. Ask 3 questions. First, how late is the source? The earliest detailed versions of the Burn the Books exchange come from writers in the 12th and 13th centuries, roughly half a millennium after Amr and Umar. That's like trying to reconstruct the policies of Henry VIII from a gossip anthology written today. Second, what genre is it? These are not sober, line-by-line chronicles in the modern sense. They are compilations that mix fact, legend, and edifying story. A sharp quote that dramatizes the triumph of revelation over human learning fits perfectly into that genre, whether or not anyone ever said it. Third, who benefits from the story? Sometimes, surprisingly, it's not Muslims. In some Christian and later European retellings, the anecdote becomes a way to paint early Islam as anti-intellectual, to set up a contrast. Enlightened Greeks on one side, blind dogmatists on the other. In some internal Muslim debates, a version of the story can be used to argue about how much value to assign to pre-Islamic learning. In both cases, the line is doing ideological work. When a quotation hits all these marks, late, anecdotal, morally satisfying, politically useful, historians step back. We don't have to prove it false to treat it as suspicious. We just have to notice that the people closest to the events, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, do not tell it. And when we look at those earlier layers, a different picture comes into view. 7th century sources describe Alexandria as a major city, still rich, still contested, but not as a glowing beacon of classical scholarship. The great state-sponsored research culture of the Hellenistic period is centuries gone. The temple networks that once anchored collections like the Serapeum have been dismantled or repurposed. Christian schools, bishops' libraries, and monasteries have become the primary custodians of Greek learning. In other words, by the time the Arab armies arrive, whatever is left of Alexandrian books is scattered through church institutions, private holdings, and the broader Eastern Mediterranean. It is not sitting intact in a single building waiting for one caliph's order. Conquest, though, still matters for knowledge. When a city changes hands, so do its tax flows. Revenues that once funded certain schools, churches, or charitable endowments might be redirected to new garrisons, mosques, or administrative offices. A bishop who had been a patron of copyists may find his budget cut. A new governor may choose to support different scholars and scribes. Administrative systems change. Greek, long the language of bureaucracy, starts to share space with Arabic. Over time, official documents, legal codes, and account books shift into the new tongue. That doesn't immediately erase Greek texts, but it changes incentives. Learning Greek becomes less crucial for a career in government. Fewer students take it up, fewer people can read the older books. Patronage follows prestige. Under the early caliphate, centres like Damascus, then Baghdad, become the gravitational poles for high learning. When ambitious scholars and translators look for support, they migrate toward those courts. Manuscripts move with them, copied, traded, or borrowed from Christian and Jewish communities across Syria, Iraq, and beyond. In this sense, the Arab conquest of Egypt is part of a larger rewiring of intellectual geography. Some Alexandrian traditions are absorbed into the new networks, through Coptic and Greek clergy, through physicians, through administrators trained in the late Roman system who now serve new masters. Other strands simply fail to catch onto fresh institutions and quietly unravel. This is why debunking the bathhouse fuel story doesn't give us the comforting clarity we might want. Saying, no, Umar probably didn't burn the Library of Alexandria, doesn't tell us exactly when a given astronomical or historical work stopped being copied. It doesn't mark a sharp boundary between books that survived and books that vanished. It just removes one dramatic scene. The deeper reality is slower and harder to dramatize. Texts die when no one needs them enough to pay for new copies. They fade when the languages they are written in slip out of daily use. They evaporate when their subject matter no longer fits the questions teachers are asking or the training that careers require. Sometimes conquest accelerates those shifts. Sometimes it even protects certain works by moving them into new hands that value them differently. The same Arab-Islamic world that a legend blames for burning Alexandria will, within a few centuries, sponsor a vast translation movement that preserves and extends Greek science and philosophy. So instead of clinging to a single satisfying quotation, we are left with a quieter stance. We can admit that by the 7th century, Alexandria's famous book culture had already been hollowed out by centuries of war, economic strain, religious change, and sheer material decay. We can see that the Arab conquest is one more turn in that process, not a sudden, isolated catastrophe that flips a switch from light to darkness. Holding that uncertainty, without filling it with bonfires, is less thrilling than a story about bathhouses heated by Aristotle. But it is closer to how knowledge actually lives and dies, not in one spectacular moment, but in a long, uneven negotiation between texts and the changing worlds that may or may not choose to copy them. If there was no single night of flames, no last cart of scrolls trundling into a furnace, what then was truly lost? To answer that, it helps to think not in terms of one library, but of different ways that texts disappear. One category is almost invisible, works that were never widely copied in the first place. Imagine a scholar in early Ptolemaic Alexandria working on a narrow problem in geometry, or an official compiling shipping records for a few harbours, or a physician keeping personal case notes. These things exist on papyrus. They may even sit for a while on a shelf in the Mouseion, or in a temple archive, or in a clerk's office. But they are not Homer or Euripides or a popular handbook of astrology. They are not the kinds of texts students memorize or householders quote at dinner parties. When the original copies wear out, get damp, or are eaten by insects, no one commissions a fresh copy. The knowledge folds back into the stream of practice. The scroll itself simply stops. This kind of loss leaves almost no trace. We sometimes glimpse it when an ancient author complains about how obscure a previous treatise was, or mentions borrowing a colleague's notes. Most of those one-off works, technical reports, local chronicles, and ephemeral drafts, winked out of existence without ever entering the wider manuscript economy. A second category vanishes more slowly, works that fall out of fashion. Copying is expensive. In antiquity and the Middle Ages, every new manuscript meant someone buying material, hiring or being a scribe, and devoting long hours to the task. That labour followed taste, curriculum and moral priority. When rhetoric was the core of elite education, speeches and handbooks thrived. When Christian bishops needed proof texts against heresies, certain philosophical works became hot commodities, others were ignored. When monastic communities turned toward devotional reading, some classical genres, satyr plays, ribald comedies, manuals of erotic magic, quietly stopped being recopied. No one had to ban them. They just slipped out of syllabi. We can see that process in the gaps. Whole authors known to Alexandrian scholars by the dozens of plays or books they wrote survive today in a single work. Or not at all. Others survive only in fragments, because later authors thought one passage was useful or beautiful enough to quote, while the rest of the original felt irrelevant to their world. There is also a subtler kind of disappearance tied to language and script. Alexandria was a Greek-speaking project in a multilingual region. Over centuries, texts existed in Egyptian, Greek, Latin, various local dialects. Later, Coptic, Syriac, and Arabic enter the story. Every time a language loses prestige or daily speakers, its written works face a test. Will someone translate them? If the answer is no, they tend to fade. Some Greek scientific and philosophical works passed through Syriac into Arabic and Latin, and from there into modern print. Others, especially in genres like new comedy, local history or minor poetic subcultures, stayed tied to Greek. When Greek education declined in a given place, those texts stopped moving. The same happened on smaller scales, when Egyptian writing shifted from hieroglyphic and hieratic to demotic, then to Coptic alphabets. Some older temple archives were simply left unread. When administrative Greek in Egypt yielded to Arabic, not every papyrus contract or commentary earned a new life in translation. Underneath all of this is the brute fact of material fragility and economics. Papyrus is tough in the right climate, but still vulnerable, to mould in a damp cellar, to fire from a single dropped lamp, to mice nesting in a cupboard. Parchment is sturdier but more costly. Every few generations, custodians had to decide which worn rolls or codices deserved replacement. You can think of it as a long series of quiet triage decisions. A monastery with 10 sheets of parchment to spare chooses Augustine over a minor grammarian. A city archive reuses an older roll as scrap, because it needs wrapping for tax receipts. A student scrapes an existing text off a parchment page to write a newer, more relevant one on top. That brings us to a distinct mode of loss, selection from within texts themselves. Ancient and medieval readers loved excerpts and epitomes. Why copy a sprawling multi-volume history when you can have a handy abridgment? Why keep a dense technical treatise when someone has already extracted the useful bits into a manual? Over time, those summaries replace the originals in everyday use. The long version stops being recopied. Its quirks, its asides, its unorthodox theories vanish, while a thin layer of its content survives in someone else's digest. Sometimes we can still feel the outline of what is gone. Later authors quote a lost play of Sophocles or refer to Book 11 of a history no one can now read. Byzantine encyclopedists summarize doctrines according to such and such a philosopher whose own works no longer exist. Catalogues from antiquity list titles we cannot match to any surviving text. These are the ghost books of the ancient world. We know them only by name, or by a few lines embedded in other works, or by the way they shaped debates whose written record is now lopsided. They tell us that the universe of ancient writing was much larger than the small constellation of texts that made it into modern editions. So when we think about Alexandria and what it lost, we are really looking at layers of disappearance, works that never left one room, works that drifted out of fashion, works marooned in dying languages, works pared down into handbooks, and works that survive only as echoes in quotation. In the next part of the story, we turn from these absences to the more surprising side, the manuscripts that did survive, not as museum pieces, but embedded in schools, sermons, and scribal habits that barely mentioned Alexandria at all. When the great libraries of antiquity fade from the record, the story doesn't end in some darkened, empty hall. It continues in a much more ordinary place, the classroom. By late antiquity, the core of higher education around the Eastern Mediterranean wasn't a single library, but a curriculum. Young elites in cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and later Constantinople spent years doing the same kinds of exercises, copying passages, memorizing model speeches, imitating good style, arguing both sides of imaginary court cases. That habit created its own gravity field around certain texts. If a work became a standard school book, it gained a kind of immortality. Grammarians used Homer to teach vocabulary and grammar. Rhetoricians drilled students on Demosthenes and other famous orators. Commentators wrote explanations. Then other commentators wrote explanations of the explanations. Marges filled with glosses and alternative readings. Teachers compiled handbooks of rhetorical figures, lists of standard mythological references, collections of set-piece descriptions. This is why, when you look at the survival list of Greek literature, it doesn't look random. It is full of what teachers found useful for training memory, style, and moral reflection. Epic, tragedy, big-name philosophy, model orations, basic mathematical and astronomical treatises. Those were the texts most likely to be pulled off a shelf when a worn copy needed replacing. Not because anyone was thinking we must preserve the heritage of Alexandria, but because next year's students would need something to pass. Byzantine scribes inherited this school world and quietly turned into some of history's most important preservationists. From roughly the 9th century onward, Constantinople became the main hub for copying Greek books. Emperors, bishops, and wealthy laypeople endowed scriptoria. Monasteries on Mount Athos, in Asia Minor, in the Balkans, and in southern Italy all kept scribes busy reproducing works that had already passed through many hands. They didn't copy everything. They copied what their curriculum and their piety pointed them toward. That meant the New Testament and the Church Fathers, of course. But it also meant Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, the major tragedians and historians. Many of the Greek scientific texts we read today come to us through Byzantine copies made more than 1,000 years after the Library of Alexandria's heyday. In the process, Byzantine scholars put their own stamp on the material. They organized big, unwieldy rolls into codices. They divided continuous texts into chapters and sections. They wrote summaries at the beginnings of works, tables of contents, cross-references to other authors. They corrected what looked like obvious scribal slips in older copies, and sometimes introduced new mistakes of their own. Alongside this, they loved to make anthologies. A florilegium, literally a gathering of flowers, was a collection of choice excerpts on a theme: ethics, theology, rhetoric, natural phenomena. Compilers pulled lines from dozens or hundreds of earlier works and arranged them under headings. For a busy preacher or teacher, this was gold. You could find a neat quotation on justice or the courage of a good ruler without wading through an entire play or philosophical dialogue. But there was a cost. When excerpts satisfied a need, the full originals were less likely to be recopied. Over centuries, some works survive mainly as thin slices embedded in these anthologies. We meet otherwise lost authors only as names attached to a paragraph in a Byzantine moral handbook. We get half a page of a vanished historian quoted by a later encyclopedist. The Florilegium preserves a fragment and erases a context. The argument that led up to the line, "The subtle structure of the book, The parts the compiler judged irrelevant, those are gone. Institutionally, the torch passed from places like the Mouseion to new kinds of centres. Imperial and patriarchal libraries in Constantinople functioned in some ways like successors to Alexandria's collection. They gathered books from across the empire, catalogued them, and made them available to a small circle of scholars and clerics. We hear of specific rooms, specific cupboards full of codices, specific officials in charge of the books. Further out, in the provinces, monastic communities became local memory banks. A monastery might own only a few shelves of texts, but within those shelves, carefully chosen works could bridge errors. A medical handbook descended from Hellenistic treatises, a geometry text copied from a late antique exemplar, a battered copy of a classical poet, still used to teach basic literacy. Transmission across these networks was rarely clean. Scribes misread letters, skipped lines, or accidentally copied the same phrase twice. Whole lines might drop out when two similar endings caught a tired eye. Diagrams in mathematical and astronomical works could be redrawn slightly wrong, then recopied in that distorted form for centuries. In some manuscripts of scientific texts, you can see layers, an original, a clumsy correction, a later gloss trying to puzzle out why the numbers don't quite add up. Sometimes texts were deliberately smoothed to fit new tastes. A pagan reference might be softened, a blunt passage about sexuality toned down, a doctrinally suspect line marked or reworded. Over time, the work that survives is not exactly what its Hellenistic author wrote, but a version that has travelled through many cultural filters. This is survival with scars. When modern editors reconstruct a text, they compare multiple Byzantine manuscripts, each with its own pattern of errors and fixes. By aligning them, they try to work backward towards something like the original. The fact that they can do this at all tells you how much material made it through the long bottleneck of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, but also how bruised that material can be. What's striking is how undramatic most of this looks in the sources. There is no heroic midnight rescue of scrolls from collapsing shelves. There is instead a teacher choosing which author to assign, a monk deciding which codex to recopy this winter, a compiler snipping a favourite paragraph into an anthology. Ordinary professional habits repeated for centuries turned out to be far more important for the afterlife of Alexandrian knowledge than any single act of destruction or preservation. In other words, a great deal of what we imagine as lost or saved from Alexandria survived not in hidden vaults, but in plain sight, in schoolrooms, sermons, and scribal notebooks. The drama was slow and procedural. In the next part of the story, we follow a different path of survival. Texts that left Greek behind entirely and found new lives in other languages, passing through Syriac scholars and into the Arabic translation movement. When Greek stopped being the everyday language of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, that didn't mean Greek ideas stopped moving. They just started travelling with a different passport. One of the most important of these new passports was Syriac. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, the same broad language family that had once been the working tongue of the Persian Empire. By late antiquity, it was the liturgical and literary language of several Christian communities in Syria and Mesopotamia. These communities built schools, monasteries, and scriptoria of their own. They studied scripture, of course, but they also studied medicine, logic, and philosophy. To do that, they needed Greek books, so a long, quiet chain begins. A Greek text written in Alexandria or Pergamon gets copied in Antioch. A few centuries later, a Syriac-speaking Christian scholar in Edessa or Nisibis wants to teach Galen's anatomy or Aristotle's logic to students who don't know Greek well. He translates word by word at first, sometimes painfully literally, then with more confidence as technical vocabulary stabilizes. Marges fill with clarifications, This Greek term has no exact equivalent. Here is what it means. Teachers write commentaries in Syriac, explaining difficult passages, arguing with older Greek commentators, bringing in examples from their own world. By the 6th and 7th centuries, you can see a distinct Syriac scholarly network. Monasteries like Keneshre on the Euphrates turned into relay stations for Greek learning. Bishops and physicians circulated between Persian and Roman territory, carrying codices and notebooks. Some scholars, like Sergius of Rashena, translated whole clusters of medical and philosophical works into Syriac. Others specialized in commentaries, turning dense Greek treatises into something a Syriac-speaking student could actually use. Then the political map shifts again. In the 7th century, Arab Muslim armies conquer Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Greek is still present in some cities, but the new ruler's language is Arabic. Administrations gradually switch, so do courts, markets, and slowly education. This could have been another dead end for Greek science. Instead, it became a detour. Early Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad, especially in the 8th and 9th centuries, were deeply interested in useful knowledge. Astronomy for calendars and navigation, medicine for court and army, mathematics for taxation and engineering, philosophy and logic for theology and law. They did not build a single new Library of Alexandria and fill it with everything. What they created was something more like an ecosystem. Patrons, caliphs, princes, wealthy bureaucrats, hired translators. Many of these translators were Christian scholars from Syriac communities who knew Greek and Syriac and could then learn Arabic. Families like the Banu Musa and the famous translator Hunayn ibn Ishaq organized teams. They acquired Greek manuscripts from Byzantine lands, from old local collections, and crucially from Syriac monasteries that already had translated and glossed copies. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was less a single shining building and more a cluster of circles. Translation workshops, patronage networks, debating salons, observatories and hospitals. Books circulated between them. What got translated was not random. Medical texts were high priority. Hippocratic treatises, Galen's handbooks, pharmacological works. These were immediately practical, court physicians needed them. Mathematical and astronomical works came next. Euclid's Elements, Ptolemy's Almagest, Archimedes, Apollonius, texts on arithmetic, algebraic precursors, planetary models. They were needed for Islamic ritual timekeeping, for navigation, for astrology, which many elites took very seriously. Philosophy and logic, especially Aristotle and his Greek and late antique commentators, also drew intense interest. They offered tools for argument that theologians could use in interreligious debates and in internal disputes. Other sciences followed: optics, mechanics, meteorology, even works on agriculture and animal husbandry. But translation was never just copying. Moving a text from Greek to Syriac to Arabic meant rebuilding it layer by layer. Technical terms had to be invented. A Greek concept might have no neat Syriac equivalent, so translators coined a phrase. When that phrase moved into Arabic, it might become a single new technical word. Over time, an Arabic philosophical vocabulary emerged that did not simply mirror Greek, but reshaped it. Jawwa for substance, arad for accident, nafs for soul, aqwel for intellect. These words carried connotations from Quranic Arabic, from everyday speech, and from earlier Syriac experiments. Commentary played a huge role in this transformation. Translators did not just bring over the base text. They brought over Greek commentaries on that text, then added their own. A single work of Aristotle might arrive wrapped in 3 or 4 layers of earlier interpretation, plus fresh marginal notes in Syriac, then Arabic notes on the Syriac notes. In Baghdad, scholars like al-Kindi, al-Farabi, and later Avicenna did not read pure Aristotle. They read Aristotle as mediated by centuries of discussion, and then they wrote new treatises that recomposed the whole package into something fitted to Islamic intellectual life. Through this complicated route, some works survived that otherwise would have vanished. Large parts of Galen's medical writings are lost in Greek, but preserved in Arabic translation, sometimes via Syriac. The same is true for certain works of Alexander of Aphrodisias, a key commentator on Aristotle, and for bits of mathematical and astronomical literature. In some cases, our only access to a Hellenistic author is an Arabic version produced in Baghdad from a Syriac version produced centuries earlier in a monastery on the frontier. When modern scholars want to reconstruct these lost Greek texts, they sometimes have to work backwards through Arabic, noticing calques of Greek syntax, Syriac loanwords and technical phrases that hint at what the original might have said. All of this complicates the idea of secret survival. The knowledge that once sat on shelves in Alexandria did not mostly vanish into hidden underground vaults. It often moved quite visibly, but under new names and in new languages. A theorem might show up in an Arabic algebra book with a Muslim author's name on the cover. Its Greek origin acknowledged briefly or not at all. A medical technique might travel in a handbook used in a Baghdad hospital, its ancestry passing through Hippocrates, Galen, Syriac translators, and a long chain of scribes. From the outside it can look like rupture, the ancient world ending, a new civilization beginning. But if you follow the texts themselves, the line is more like a braid. Greek, Syriac, and Arabic strands wrap around each other, carrying forward ideas that no single library controlled. In the next part, that braid narrows again into even thinner threads. Individual codices in private hands, marginal notes, overwritten pages in monastery libraries, places where, by pure accident, pieces of the ancient world managed to cling on. Follow one of those codices as the great networks thin out. Not every book lived in a palace library or a famous school. A surprising amount of surviving ancient literature comes from something much quieter. The shelf in a private study, the chest in a merchant's house, the locked cupboard in a provincial official's office. In the Roman and late antique worlds, wealthy households often kept small collections of books. A senator in Rome, a rhetorician in Antioch, a landowner in Egypt. If they had the money and the inclination, they might own a few dozen, maybe a few hundred rolls or codices. Poetry they liked, legal handbooks they needed, medical recipes, a favourite historian, a philosophical dialogue that had impressed them as a student. Most of these collections were modest. They weren't trying to gather all knowledge. They were built around taste, family tradition, practical needs. But because they were scattered, they were also resilient. An imperial library can burn once and be gone. 1,000 little bookrooms are harder to wipe out. Some families copy their favourite texts for their children. Some heirs sell books off piecemeal. A few codices travel as gifts, dowries, or part of a scholar's luggage when he moves for work. Each movement is a small roll of the dice. One copy is lost in a flood. Another, slightly different, ends up in a monastery. A third is forgotten in a private house and survives because no one bothers to reuse the parchment. This is one sense in which secret survival operates. Not deliberate hiding, just many small private caches no one bothered to catalogue on a monumental scale. Monasteries add another layer. From late antiquity onward, Christian monastic communities became some of the main places where texts were copied. But the picture here is nuanced. Not every monastery was a centre of classical learning, and not every monk cared about Homer or Euclid. Some houses focused almost entirely on scripture, liturgy, and local saints' lives. Their libraries were narrow but intense. Others, especially larger and wealthier communities, kept a broader curriculum: grammar, rhetoric, some philosophy, bits of medicine or natural history useful for understanding creation or treating the sick. In those places, classical authors lived in a kind of twilight. A pagan poet could be tolerated if quoted by a church father, or if his verses were mined for moral examples or elegant language. A philosophical handbook might be copied because it helped train reasoning skills for theology. A medical treatise could survive because the infirmary needed it. Often these texts were not prized for their own sake, but for what they could do in a Christian framework. Still, a scribe who enjoys a text is more likely to copy it carefully. A teacher who finds a certain commentary useful will ask for new copies when the old ones wear out. A community that prides itself on its school will preserve the books that keep that school running. Over centuries, these local decisions produce a skewed but real channel of transmission. At the same time, parchment was expensive. A codex that seemed marginal could be viewed as a resource. That's where palimpsests come in. A palimpsest is a reused manuscript. Scribes scrape or wash the ink off old parchment and write something new on top. To the monks doing this, it was often a sensible, even pious act. Why let old, useless, or even suspect texts sit on the shelf when the community needed copies of scripture, sermons, or legal documents? To us, those faint, half-erased letters underneath can be gold. With modern imaging techniques, multispectral photography, ultraviolet light, scholars can sometimes read the undertext of a palimpsest. This has yielded fragments of lost plays, obscure histories, mathematical treatises, and early versions of well-known works. The famous Archimedes palimpsest, for example, preserves material that would otherwise be completely unknown. This doesn't mean monks were running a secret vault of pagan science. It means they were recycling, and the recycling process accidentally stored layers of older writing in a way that could later be recovered. The secrecy is retrospective. We could not see the hidden text until we invented the tools to look for it. In between these institutional and private worlds, there's simple caution. In unstable times, books are valuables. They represent years of labour. They can be sold. They can also attract trouble. A text associated with a rival faction, a suspect theological position, or a condemned philosophy might be safer out of sight. A house owner might tuck a codex into a chest because local politics have turned, or because a new regime is suspicious of certain writings. That doesn't automatically mean deliberate, organised suppression. Often it's the mundane logic of risk management. Keep the expensive and potentially controversial thing somewhere safe and quiet. Over time, safe and quiet becomes forgotten. All along there is the huge impersonal force of archaeological luck. Some environments are kind to books. Dry deserts preserve papyrus and parchment that would rot in a damp climate. That's why so many of our best finds for everyday documentary texts and some literary works come from Egypt. Rubbish heaps at places like Oxyrhynchus, abandoned houses in villages along the Nile, buried caches where old documents were tossed and then sealed under sand. Elsewhere, ruined cities leave storerooms and basements full of carbonized or compacted material that only looks like junk until someone digs. A collapsed room in a villa, a corner of a bathhouse used for storage. A synagogue, Geniza, where worn-out texts were deposited for eventual ritual burial and then never removed. Each of these is an accidental time capsule. No one set out to preserve a particular poem or letter for us. They were just following local customs for disposal or storage. Fire, flood, sand, and architecture did the rest. When we talk about works that survived in secret, it's worth deflating the drama a little. Most of the time, secrecy is not a cabal guarding forbidden wisdom. It is the combination of scarcity, too few copies to spread everywhere, local politics that make some texts inconvenient, and ordinary people trying to protect or repurpose valuable materials. a book kept in a chest during a purge, a scroll quietly sold to a monastery, a codex scraped for its parchment, but still whispering faintly under the new ink. This is also a good place to mention, if you enjoy following these thin threads of survival, the channel has a book on 12 historical mysteries that remain unresolved, not because of secret societies, but because the evidence is patchy and the accidents of preservation are strange. You can find it on our website. There's a link in the description. In the end, survival in secret usually means this: a text that drops out of public circulation but lingers somewhere on a private shelf, in a monastic cupboard, under the script of a prayer book, in a rubbish dump under dry sand, until chance and modern curiosity intersect. From these fragments we can do something remarkable. We can trace not just that a work existed, but how its ideas moved. In the next section we'll follow a few concrete cases, particular books and concepts that slipped through the fingers of empires and libraries alike, and somehow washed up on the shores of our own time. Begin with mathematics. Imagine a theorem not as a single text, but as a tune. Euclid's Elements almost certainly sat on the shelves at Alexandria. It was copied, commented on, argued over, but the reason it survived is not only that a particular codex escaped a fire. It's that the core propositions became teaching tools. In late antiquity and the medieval world, students of geometry didn't just read Euclid once and move on. They learned proofs by heart. Teachers developed standard ways of explaining them, then wrote those explanations down as commentaries, and commentaries on commentaries. Scholars like Pappus, Theon, and later, in the Islamic world, Al-Nayrizi and others, rewrote elements line by line, adding glosses, alternative proofs, corrections. Each new layer of commentary required a fresh copy of the base text. You couldn't explain proposition I-47, the famous Pythagorean theorem, without including it. So the theorem travelled not only in Euclid's own words, but in paraphrases, classroom notes, worked examples in problem books. Even when parts of the original treatises were lost, the tune persisted. A later mathematician would say, as is known from the books on plane figures, and then restate the result. Over centuries, the chain of commentary becomes a rope. Cut one strand, and others still hold. That's how a geometric idea can cross from Alexandria to late antique schools, into Syriac and Arabic translation, and eventually reappear in a Latin manuscript copied in a monastery more than 1,000 years later. Medicine followed a similar but even more relentless logic. Here, the copying engine was not abstract teaching but sick bodies. From the Hellenistic period onward, physicians in Greek, then in Roman, then in Syriac and Arabic traditions had to decide what to do with patients in front of them. They needed recipes for drugs, procedures for setting bones, advice on fevers, pregnancies, eye infections. So they built compendia, big organized handbooks that summarized earlier authorities. Galen is the towering name, but he is only one node in a much longer chain. Alexandria's own medical school produced anatomical studies and pharmacological catalogues. Later, doctors folded those into encyclopedias. When the original research disappeared, the summary survived. Hospitals, whether civic institutions in the late Roman East, infirmaries in monasteries, or bimaristans in the Islamic world, had every incentive to keep practical texts usable. A worn book of remedies gets replaced. Sections are excerpted into smaller handbooks. Favourite treatments get copied into marginal notes and vade-mecum booklets that a travelling doctor can pack in a saddlebag. This creates a different kind of survival. We rarely have the full library of an Alexandrian physician. We do have echoes, dosage tables, named drugs, surgical techniques, all embedded in later compilations. The original shelves are gone. The clinical habits they fostered are still faintly legible. Astronomy shows yet another pattern. If you want to predict an eclipse or compute the position of Mars, you need numbers that work. Tables of planetary motions, rising times of stars, lengths of months, these are not just curiosities, but working tools for astrologers, calendar makers, religious officials. At Alexandria, astronomical theory and observation were tightly linked. Hipparchus, later Ptolemy, and many lesser-known observers compiled star catalogues and numerical schemes. When Ptolemy's Almagest was produced, it did not simply sit in a library. It became a reference book for generations. Every time an astronomer in late antiquity or in 9th century Baghdad updated a table, adjusting parameters, refining values, they copied the structure they inherited. Chapter headings, ordering of topics, even example problems often echo earlier works. Translations into Syriac, Arabic, and then back into Latin carried not just Ptolemy, but also fragments of pre-Ptolemaic data that he had preserved. Here, survival is driven by usefulness. If a set of tables continues to produce roughly correct predictions, people keep reworking it. Even when they disagree with the old cosmology, they keep the numerical backbone and adjust it. The theory can change. The scaffold of observations and parameters stretches across the rupture. Geography and travel knowledge drift along similar currents. The great world surveys of the Hellenistic Age, some associated with Alexandrian scholarship, do not come down to us whole. But their DNA is scattered through later works. Roman and Byzantine compilers loved excerpts. A writer like Strabo pulls together earlier geographers, travel narratives, periploi, coastal sailing guides into a huge synthesis. Later, parts of Strabo are summarized again. Port-to-port distances, lists of cities, descriptions of river systems are copied into handbooks for administrators and merchants. Maps, where they existed, were fragile. Parchment map sheets tear, fade, and vanish. Yet the information they carried, it is 3 days from here to the next major port. Beyond that lies a dangerous shoal, finds its way into itineraries, pilgrim guides, and eventually into medieval Mappe Mundi and Portolan charts. Across this chain, bits of Alexandrian-style geography survive as bare lists, as offhand remarks, as authorities quoted without attribution. We meet them without names, tucked into late Roman route maps or Arabic books on climates and regions. The grand treatise is gone. Its building blocks are still in use. Literature works differently and more harshly. Poets and playwrights are not usually instruments. Their survival depends on fashion, education, and quotation. Some authors, Homer, the tragic triad of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, became central to school curricula. Children learned to read on their verses. Teachers compiled commentaries and school editions. Because these texts were repeatedly copied for teaching, they had many chances to survive. Others were admired but not required. A minor Hellenistic poet might be quoted occasionally for a clever line, then fade out of copying lists. A playwright admired in Alexandria could be unknown in late antique Antioch if no teacher there chose to include him. That is why so many authors reach us as fragments. A speech from a lost play survives because a later rhetorician used it as an example. A couplet appears in an anthology of witty sayings. A mythological detail survives in a scholion, a marginal note on a more famous text. The full roll or codex is gone, but shards cling to the walls of other books. Underlying all of this is a quiet but powerful force, citation culture. From the Hellenistic age onward, scholars increasingly signalled where they got things. As Eratosthenes says, according to the astronomers of Alexandria, the best doctors teach that these phrases repeated and recopied turned later authors into accidental archives. A church historian preserves a snippet of a lost pagan chronicle because he wants to argue with it. An Islamic philosopher transmits a line of Greek physics while criticizing it. A Byzantine encyclopedist, compiling entries on everything from fish to festivals, mines older works now lost and embeds their sentences verbatim. In this way, the destruction of a single library does not erase everything it once held. Ideas that passed through Alexandria, proofs, recipes, star positions, place names, verses, leak outward into teaching traditions, practical handbooks, syntheses and footnotes. When the original scroll disappears, those later traces become our only access. They are not clean, not complete, and never neutral. They are filtered through the needs and interests of later ages. But by reading them carefully, comparing versions, and following the trails of citation and paraphrase, we can still watch certain Alexandrian ideas walking through time long after their shelves have turned to dust. So where does that leave the library itself? Not as a single bonfire, not as one clean date you can write on a timeline, but as a long, uneven twilight. Scrolls decayed on their own shelves. Catalogues went out of date. Funding dried up. Wars and riots damaged buildings and broke chains of continuity. Religious transitions shifted what was considered worth copying. Political changes rerouted patronage to other cities. Those are the main loss mechanisms we can see: fragile materials, local violence, institutional neglect, shifting tastes. Against them stand the survival pathways we've been tracing. Teaching traditions that turned texts into habits. Commentary chains that tied every new explanation to an older authority. Practical handbooks in medicine, astronomy and geography that kept useful knowledge in circulation. Translation movements that recopied Greek into Syriac and Arabic, then into Latin and vernacular languages. Private copies, monastic libraries, scribes who reused parchment but left ghosts of older writing beneath the ink. No single rescue, just many small, imperfect lifelines. When we look back from a great distance, our minds prefer clean stories: the day it burned, the man who ordered the books destroyed, the moment civilization lost its memory. Those myths form easily when the evidence is thin and the loss feels enormous. They are ways of mourning. They also tell us something about ourselves. The legend of Alexandria reflects our fear that knowledge is fragile, that a single act of vandalism or neglect can throw us into darkness. It also projects a hope that somewhere someone saved everything, and that one day we might find the hidden archive and set things right. The reality is quieter, but in some ways kinder. Preservation has never been a single heroic gesture. It is a habit, a scribe staying up late to finish a copy, a teacher choosing to include one poem in a syllabus and not another, a translator puzzling over a difficult line until it makes sense in a new language, a reader in any century deciding that a book is worth keeping a little longer. Every time someone makes that choice, the network thickens. Ideas get one more chance to cross a gap. You're part of that network too, even now, half awake, listening to a voice talk about a building that no longer stands. If you'd like to help this little corner of the web keep telling old stories in careful ways, you can gently tap like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there as this reaches you. And if you want to support this work in the best way, you can listen on Spotify. The link is in the description. Each listen there helps this channel keep preserving and sharing, one quiet episode at a time. The Library of Alexandria is gone. The world of words it helped shape is not. It lives on in fragments, in translations, in habits of thought and teaching, and in the simple act of passing knowledge along. As you drift towards sleep, you're resting inside that living network, another brief but real moment in the long chain of people who refuse to let everything be forgotten.